listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events across our states as well as across the divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Jane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, getting into the headlines this morning. First up in COVID news, at least 1,990 new coronavirus deaths and 139,293 new cases were reported in the U.S. yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 146,409 cases per day, a decrease of 29% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Tuesday morning, more than 26,358,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 443,275 have died from it. Cricket Australia said it had, quote, no choice, end quote, but to postpone their tour of South Africa in February and March, where the teams were due to play 3 tests. Those are matches or games in the sport of cricket, because of the health situation in South Africa, where a more contagious variant of the virus has been reported. Back in the States, in Minneapolis, public school district staff were expected to return to in-person teaching Monday, but a ruling from Hennepin County District Court Judge Susan Robiner said that staff and teachers who had accommodations to work from home or were in the process of applying for them did not have to return with the rest of the staff. The ruling came after the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers and Education Support Professionals accused the school district of denying accommodations for teachers and staff who were either at high risk of contracting COVID-19 or were caring for a household member who is at risk of getting the virus. Over in Chicago, roughly 62,000 students and about 10,000 teachers and staff in K through 8, kindergarten through 8th grade, were expected to return to in-class learning Monday for the first time since last March. That's part of the district's gradual reopening plans. Teachers in the nation's third largest school district voted last month to continue to work remotely, saying the district was insisting teachers return to unsafe buildings. Due to conflict, Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the CEO of Chicago Public Schools said Monday that they had reached an, quote, important milestone, end quote, and that students will continue learning virtually Tuesday and Wednesday as a 48-hour cooling off period. In national political news, former President Trump's new political action committee, Save America, brought in about $31 million during the final weeks of 2020. The bulk of that money, $30.4 million, was transferred from the Trump Make America Great Again committee. Oregon has become the first state in the U.S. to fully decriminalize small amounts of street drugs. The law, known as Measure 110, went into effect on Monday. Instead of a criminal charge, those found with personal use amounts of heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, LSD, oxycodone, and ecstasy will face a $100 fine. It's still technically criminal. You know, you're facing a fine. I've just got to say. I thought all of a sudden you'd just be able to shoot up anywhere, Jamarl.
Is that what you thought? Yeah, maybe. I didn't think we were going to be able to shoot up anywhere, but I didn't think there was going to be I don't know if I thought it was going to be a fine associated with it. Yeah, technically it is still a fine. You know what I mean? So I feel you. But that's far better than jail. But jail shouldn't be the standard anyway.
What's crazy is that for how cheap a lot of these hard drugs have gotten, the fine might be more expensive in a lot of cases than the drugs that you got fined for. Just pointing that out too. It's legitimately a thing. Anyway, several new policies have been announced by Minneapolis and its police department fueled by the death of George Floyd in May, including Minneapolis police officers will no longer be allowed to deactivate their body cameras in order to hold private conversations during the course of their response to an incident. Police must announce their presence and purpose before entering a no-knock warrant situation, except in certain circumstances like hostage standoffs and the banning of the use of chokeholds. The city has also revised the policy regarding the review of body camera footage after a critical incident. They have overhauled its use of force policy and added an embedded assistant city attorney to advise on police misconduct investigations. This, as Chicago has recorded 51 homicides in January. That's the highest total the city has recorded for the month in 4 years. In an Instagram Live last night, 31-year-old Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez blasted Republicans for denying responsibility for the Capitol siege and being told to move on from the riots. She then revealed that she is a survivor of sexual assault. In international news, as we were talking about yesterday, Myanmar's military, also known as the Tatmadaw, declared a one-year state of emergency on Monday in what international observers have termed a military coup. State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi and President Win Myint were among those who were detained during a series of raids. Now, Myanmar's military has issued a notice to airmen suspending all domestic, international, and relief flights until 11:59 p.m. local time on May 31st for the next couple of months here, the next 4 months about. That's a big step. This says internet was shut down in the capital and the country's largest cities, and TV services temporarily stopped broadcasting before coming back on. This is a coup, folks, and it's a major step back for the country. We should be getting more coverage on this soon. We're having a little bit of a hard time finding folks who you know enough about it to feel qualified talking about it, but it's also an interesting story. Anyway, any comments on that before we move on, Jamarl?
No, I really want to get somebody on. I mean, because that's, like you said, it's a step backwards. And it's a step backwards in an already complicated situation. The leader of that country, like you said, had been, well, yeah, let's get somebody on first. I don't delve into it if we can hit the story as a full-throated story. So yeah, we'll bring somebody on.
It's an interesting story in a number of ways. And so I'm looking forward, just even on like a personal conversational level, just in terms of how much enjoyment I expect to get out of talking about it. Not that it's just me, but it's an interesting topic. If you look into the history, if you look into the players, if you look into recent developments, there's a lot of stuff there, but we'll come back to that later. U.S. President Joe Biden has made a statement warning that America could reinstate sanctions on Myanmar in light of the military takeover in the country. Biden's statement on Monday said, quote, the international community should come together in one voice to press the Burmese military to immediately relinquish the power they have seized, release the activists and officials they have detained, lift all telecommunications restrictions, and refrain from violence against civilians, end quote. Here's the thing, though, man. I mean, you have these sort of point-wise sanctions that you can apply. You've got the Magnitsky sanctions, which have already been applied against, I think his name is Min Aung Hlaing, who's the military leader who has effectively been put in charge here. He already has sanctions levied against him personally. So does much of the military. This was over the Rohingya crisis, but they still apply. And so now what are you going to do? Are you just going to sanction the country? But isn't that going to lead to massive economic despair and the deaths and shortened livelihoods of the citizens of the country? If I'm reading this right, if I'm understanding this right, and again, maybe I'm not, that wouldn't be any better for the country, frankly, than a military takeover.
No.
That would also be pushing it back quite a bit.
Yeah, I don't know if that would be better. I mean, think of Iraq for the moment, where Albright made that famous quote where she was asked, hey, do you think it was worth it that 500,000 kids died from those sanctions? And she says, yes, it was worth it. And so if you have somebody that could say something like that, that's a Democrat. You have somebody who could say it like Pompeo for Venezuela or Abrams for Venezuela, or for that matter, Iran. And in none of these situations do they actually care about the human beings that are being hurt by the sanctions. And so I feel you, but I don't necessarily know if, even though you're right, I don't necessarily think that's going to be the thing that inhibits their actions, because it hasn't done it before. At least it doesn't seem to have done it.
Yeah, it seems like they think that by applying pressure on the general population, they can squeeze out the military at the top. Well, at the same time, what they're doing is they're setting up the circumstances for more crises of leadership in the future, where you have a public that is desperate, that needs quick assistance, and that is willing to rely on basically anybody, no matter how tyrannical, if they're able to get help. And I'm not saying that the public is relying on the military in this case. It's a lot more complicated than that. Again, we'll come back to it at some other point, but us applying broad brush sanctions certainly doesn't help. In other international news, Sylvester Ilunga, the Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, resigned on Friday after the parliament's vote of no confidence in his cabinet. Parliament voted last Wednesday to censure Ilunga after President Felix Tshisekedi Tshisekedi accused coalition partners loyal to his predecessor of undermining his plans for reforming the Central African nation. Ilunga dismissed this criticism as political maneuvering. In tech news, Chinese phone maker Xiaomi has filed a lawsuit against the U.S. government over Donald Trump's decision to place it on a blacklist, which blocks Americans from investing into the company over its suspected ties to the Chinese military. The former U.S. president, in the final days of his presidency, designated Xiaomi along with at least 8 other Chinese firms as communist Chinese military companies, meaning they're believed to have ties to the Chinese military under the National Defense Authorization Act of 1999. Firms designated as CCMC, again, that's communist Chinese military companies, are banned from receiving stock or securities investments from U.S. citizens or organizations starting mid-March, March 15th. Xiaomi's Hong Kong-listed stock plunged more than 10% this hours after the announcement of its addition to the Washington blacklist. And with that, I'm going to take us out into a slightly early break, and we will be back with Jamarl Thomas's Soapbox and Monologue segment. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in just a minute on the other side of this break.
Fault lines.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. Also, if you want to join in on the conversation, you can do that with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show, or at the very least, helps it to be what it is. So definitely don't be shy. I spoke about this before because I get greatly annoyed at undeserved acclaim, undeserved affection, or for that matter, deifying a particular person, despite the fact that the person failed magnificently. In normal circumstances, when we're looking at many of the Republican states, let's say DeSantis in Georgia or Texas, many of these states did abominably poorly in regards to dealing with COVID-19, whether it was the shutting down, the masks. They fought tooth and nail against all of these measures. And many of these people were hit very, very hard, especially as it started to proceed throughout the course of the year. One of the people, however, that were a part of this that apparently escaped all sorts of blame on this, Governor Cuomo. Now, when I say he escapes all sorts of blame, think back for them. Think back. Governor Cuomo, at one point, Democrats was looking at him as, he's going to be the person who he could run for president. It was a success in New York. And they were basically giving this guy a pat on the back. And he was running around giving a victory lap as if he just nailed it. To put this in perspective, he goes so far as to say, when prodded, that he basically, I sleep well at night. I don't have any issue going to bed. I know that Governor Cuomo, saved lives. Right here. Assign a number of your police to a task force, Cuomo said. I will do I would do it in my name, and you can blame me. I have no problem with that. I put my head on the pillow every night saying, I saved lives. That's how I sleep. And I know we have. Incompetent, ineffective government will cause lives, he later added. Yes, incompetent and ineffective government will indeed, have indeed, cost lives. And what I mean by that is despite the fact that Cuomo gets this kind of undeserved, radically undeserved idea that he was victorious in something. How do you claim victory with 44,000 deaths? How? How does that work? How do you turn around and say, oh, nailed it? I sleep well at night. How do you do that? How do you do that? Well, apparently, if your name is Andrew Cuomo, the failure of it all doesn't all that much matter. Yes, it's true that politicians often craft narratives around themselves, wrap themselves, showing this kind of false impression of reality. They do so because they need to do so. They have to be able to stay in office, and for that's a population management thing. But the catch here is, it seems that reality gave way to a certain degree of mendacity in trying to craft this particular image. And you had all sorts of liberals and Democrats screaming that that image was correct, despite the fact that the stats, the numbers, the things that Cuomo did in that state to drive that number up were more pressing. My point is, Cuomo doesn't deserve this at all. No issue of success at all, every bit as much as the other Republican governors have basically failed in their task. I mean, don't take my word for it. He's talking about incompetent government. I mean, Cuomo closed late, for one, meaning California closed early. This was an article, Tale of Two Cities, where California basically closed early by a week or so, and that week in and of itself made a difference because of the exponential spread of COVID. That's the first point. On the other point, he also shoved people in the nursing homes as this thing raged. So New York is already a packed-in location, and that packed-in location gets doubly so from the standpoint of putting people in nursing homes. And so Cuomo basically said, we're going to send people to nursing homes, and you're not allowed to test if those people are stable. So think about what we're saying for the moment. Instead of those homes being able to determine whether or not they want to bring in a COVID patient, those people no longer had the ability to even discern who had COVID. And yet we're still mandated to take those patients into the nursing home. This fails on multiple accounts, by the way. On top of that, he even put through a provision to prevent litigation against those nursing homes. Now, to put this in perspective on how bad this was, the outcomes of this, and again, talking about incompetent government and why that costs lives, 0.6% of the deaths for COVID, I said it wrong, 42% of the deaths from COVID took place in like 0.6% of the location of the population, basically nursing homes, where you're talking about nurses, you're talking about residents, you're talking about people who are, let's say, janitorial staff, basically people that were involved in nursing homes took the brunt or took a huge hit from the standpoint of COVID, larger than pretty much any other sector in our society. That number was there because of Cuomo. That number wasn't there because of magic. It wasn't an act of God. It wasn't that people said, I want to throw myself into a nursing home just to throw myself into a nursing home in the middle of a pandemic where all of us being packed together increases our chances of death. No, God didn't do that. Angels didn't do that. Republicans didn't do that. Cuomo did that. And despite Cuomo doing that, you have all of these Democrats that were saying, hey, maybe he looks presidential. He looks presidential. Maybe he could be president. Cuomo goes so far as to write the book on leadership. Did you know that? How do you have 44,000 deaths and write a book on leadership? And American Crisis, Leadership Lessons from the COVID pandemic, starring Andrew Cuomo. Isn't that shocking? Again, mendacity, making up the gap for incompetence. And that basically what we have with the Cuomo thing. This goes further, by the way, because this story has just hit the news again. Just like normal circumstances where people are wrapping a narrative around themselves. Oh, by the way, before you even get to that part, you also realize there were secondary consequences to this from that bad choice of Cuomo. One of those consequences was that COVID patients were worth more. The government was willing to pay more for COVID patients. And so what did nursing homes do? Nursing homes were being put under pressure because of their budgets. Oftentimes, people who have surgeries or conditions or selective surgeries, they would be put into a nursing home for a short period of time for care, and the nursing home would get payment for that person being there. Well, when COVID happened and many of the elective surgeries basically dried up, those nursing homes started to have difficult time making their balance sheets. Like right now, many of the nursing homes, they're saying like 99% are going to go or in threat or in danger of going bust because of the lack of funds that they have in order to keep themselves going. So what ended up happening, and this is again another mind-blowing report, was that patients were found walking the streets, delirious, sometimes with dementia. And the reason is because they put those people in hotels in order to make room for COVID patients, since those patients were more profitable. These were not acts of God. These were acts of policy. And these policies lay at the doorstep of one Governor Andrew Cuomo. So the idea that this guy wrote the book on leadership, or the idea that this guy's talking about incompetent, ineffective government will cost lives, if anybody would know, Cuomo would know, because it did cost lives, and it was incompetent. Don't misunderstand me. I get this notion that everybody didn't necessarily know in the beginning. I'm just trying to make the point that the idea that you're writing a book on leadership and all of these people died is appalling. This gets worse. Jamarl, how could that get worse? That seems pretty horrible. I mean, 44,000 people dead. The policies that Cuomo put in basically pushed those numbers along. He doesn't necessarily want to take responsibility for the deaths, all of that. Yes, but it gets worse. 52-page report. New York Attorney General Letta James announced a 52-page report which has an additional 24 pages of appendices and endnotes that says total nursing home deaths data published by the State Department of Health did not include many nursing home residents who were transferred to a hospital before they died of COVID. They were underreporting the numbers. Think about everything I just told you. Writing the book on leadership, he would have these meetings every other day. You have all these Democrats talking about that. Looks, this guy has succeeded, and this is a success, and maybe one day he could be president, and he could parlay that into something else. And the reality of it is, while he's chest stomping, while he's sitting there writing this book on leadership and how awesome he is on leadership in regards to COVID, he's sitting there undercounting the number of deaths by basically saying, if that person left the nursing home and went into the hospital, we're not going to include that as a death in a nursing home. The point was to keep those numbers artificially low, right here. Department of Health did not include many of the nursing home residents who was transferred to the hospital before they died of COVID. Underreporting from some of the nursing homes also occurred. James added, noting that more than 20 facilities are now under investigation by her office. Yes, underreporting. The state has reported 34,742 deaths in total from the virus on Wednesday, with 8,711 deaths in nursing homes statewide as of Tuesday. It is unclear how high that number goes because of the discrepancies and the underreporting. The point I'm trying to get here is that Cuomo, and while Cuomo was chest thumping, and let's be fair for the moment, right? Trump failed at this pandemic. Many of the Republican states failed at this pandemic. And you can make an honest case that says, look, the governors are going to some level be constrained by the actions of the federal government because they're going to be dependent upon the federal government for assistance. Fair enough. But I don't give that too much credence, because at the end of the day, there were choices that Cuomo made. I'm not hitting Cuomo. There's certain choices around this notion of inability to get the masks or inability to get the things that you need for supplies and everything else. What I'm hitting Cuomo for, and many of these other Democrats, is acting like this guy did something prodigious, when instead it was prodigiously incompetent. There's a difference in those things. Cuomo, left to his own devices, could have taken certain actions. He could have taken actions a little bit more swiftly. He could have taken them more immediately. And in doing so, the number of deaths would have been significantly less. Even if that number was 10,000 less, isn't that worth it? And him saying, I put my head on the pillow every night knowing that I saved lives. Yes, you might have saved lives, but you also cost lives. And that's the point I'm getting at. DeSantis and all these other guys aren't writing books on leadership. You are. Hence, this monologue. I've never come across somebody more undeserving of either their own image of themselves or, for that matter, what the party themselves want to create of that individual. And yet, here's Cuomo, basically standing on the rubble at 9/11 screaming that I was here, I did this. Just like Giuliani. In this very specific case, instead of it being 9/11, it's COVID. And he's basically trying to take responsibility and credit for a situation and a crisis that he himself caused in New York, or at the very least didn't do due diligence to mitigate it. Shane, what do you think? Am I being too hard on Governor Cuomo here? I mean, personally, I think he made some serious blunders in dealing with this. And, it's not a situation like there were other options, right? California closed a bit earlier. You had situations where he didn't have to shove those people into nursing homes. Maybe you should have been doing testing. This seems so bad. And then to turn around and this wouldn't be a huge deal to me if it wasn't them screaming that this guy should be presidential, that the liberals are showing this contrast between him and Trump. This is good governance and good leadership by Cuomo. While simultaneously
literally giving him an Emmy. Dying. Literally giving him an Emmy.
Yes.
I mean,
yes,
they literally
right there. Right.
They gave him an Emmy, which in light of everything that's come out over the past week, seems particularly relevant, I've got to say, because of how much of what he said was a fabrication, how much of he said was just acting in order to put his image up. No, I mean, you're not at all wrong. You're right on this stuff. It's ridiculous. If you think about the total discrepancy in nursing home deaths, it's about 4,000 unaccounted for deaths. This is maybe, we've used this parallel a couple of times here, but this is a uniquely New Yorkian parallel. That's more people than died in, 9/11, September 11, 2001. That is more people unaccounted for who died than on one of the most significant tragedies in American history. And Cuomo, to this point, to this day, has not fessed up to any of it. He hasn't apologized. He's blamed it on the Trump administration. He's blamed it on Donald Trump's ghost and on Roger Stone and protege of Roger Stone's. He's blamed it on the Health and Human Services order that he himself, his administration has defended.
Yes.
That basically, an order that came down effectively for a little while until it was rescinded, telling them that if people had recovered from COVID, if they were recovering, then you should send them back to the nursing homes to free up more hospital beds. And his administration has defended that, despite the fact that in all likelihood got a lot more people sick. You're putting the viral fox in the hen house, so to speak. Yeah. You're putting somebody who's the most likely to be contagious, to the most likely to be dangerous to the other people immediately around them, exactly where they're going to be most dangerous. And so it would be one thing if his administration had grudgingly had to go along with that order and had defied it when they saw it happening and had pulled out of it as soon as it ended. But instead, they defended their decisions, and they're still trying to cover their butts now, and that extends all the way up to him, of course. Now, New Yorkers are furious about this, rightfully, and a lot of them are trying to figure out how they can get rid of the guy. But is that going to get that much attention on the national scale, on the national stage? Or are we just going to remember him for the Emmy that he won? I don't know, man. This is a big crisis.
Yeah, I hope that's not what he's remembered for. But I get the feeling that may be the image that's crafted. Like right now, 9 top health officials have quit as Cuomo scorns expertise. Basically, he's trying to offshore blame. And, the rollout, the slowness and everything else, he's pointing fingers to everybody but himself. And so, this just kind of adds to this thing of him crafting this image of himself that is not entirely right. Again, I say, how do you have that many deaths and call it a success? So let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us, Mark Sloboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. Mark, welcome to the show.
Shane, Jamarl, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it. We always enjoy having you. So the reason we brought you on is because we wanted to delve. It's a few issues, actually, but let's hit the first one first. We want to get into some of the protests that have been taking place in Russia over Navalny. Now, what's interesting about this is that RT came out. This is a leaked. What is this? A leaked video that basically shows. Let me see. The top Navalny aide asked alleged British spy for millions in funding intelligence video released by Russia. Now that's prodigious, right? Navalny has basically been the person that the West has been pushing, almost like a destabilizing agent for Russia. And now you're finding out that someone within his team is basically trying to accept bribes. What do you think about this? I have a clip for this I want to show, but I want to get your take on this first.
Yeah, okay, so the person that this is about is Vladimir Ashurkov. He's a former banker in Russia who was a very close friend and one of the principal top aides of Navalny. Today, he is still the executive director of Navalny's FBK, his so-called anti-corruption foundation. This video was evidently filmed in 2012, so it's obvious that Russian intelligence has been watching him and the developments for some time. And in the video, he meets with a then British diplomat. He was then second in the embassy for political affairs. And he is evidently known by the Russian intelligence services to be an undercover MI6 agent as a diplomat, which is kind of common in a lot of countries, Russia included, it must be said. In their diplomatic staff, they usually have a fair number that are also intelligence. And Ashurkov meets with him, and he quite blatantly, he's actually pushing. The diplomat is a little cagey in his answers and doesn't quite commit to anything personally, but he asks him for $10 to $20 million. Say we could really use the money to help stage mass protests, to put out, and he quite specifically says propaganda, and so on. And he also quite specifically asks for dirt for actionable intelligence from British intelligence to use against the Russian government and top Russian businessmen that he feels need to be shown that their best interests lie away from the Russian government. He also further suggests a quid pro quo about it making it easier for British banks to work in Russia if certain Russian banks that they were targeting undergo public damage, and he suggests that they make it too hard for British banks to work. So it's really an extraordinary video, and not long after this video was evidently taped, this was 2012, Ashurkov was charged with fraud and embezzlement in Russia, and was promptly given political, quote unquote, asylum in the UK, where he is to this day, and he's right now going the kind of the talk show and Western media circuit. He was on Al Jazeera, Deutsche Welle. He wrote a public letter to Joe Biden on behalf of Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation, asking the U.S. president, on behalf of Navalny, to sanction 35 Russian individuals, right, and evidently the banks that keep their money as well, in order to force the Russian government to I guess exert force on the Russian judicial system to release Navalny, and that was actually published basically as an op-ed in USA Today. So it's pretty amazing. He has kind of jumped on the scene in the Western scene in defense of Navalny, and it's clear that Russia decided to release this quite compromising footage of him exactly right now for that reason.
Let's do this. Let's listen to the clip, or this is only going to be about a minute of the clip. This is Ashurov talking to the MI6 agent that Sloboda just described. Let's play the clip.
Espionage is a dirty word, but everyone does it. It's a tricky business, high risk, high reward. Pull it off and you hit jackpot, and no one ever finds out. But when you mess it up, it's a world of embarrassment.
Wait, let's step
as
into
was
that
the
one,
case 15 years ago.
Yeah, this might be the an exact clip.
That's an intro, kind of a dramatic intro, talking about a previous incident with a British spy rock in Moscow. Yes.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, but the clip. What do you think is going to result in this? By the way, like for all the protests and everything that has been rocking Moscow, with this clip being introduced, what effect, or does it have an effect?
Well, I don't think it'll have any real effect in Russia. I mean, it has long been suggested and assumed that Navalny is working with Western intelligence agencies. On top of all the inconsistencies in this recent supposed poisoning in Germany and his miraculous recovery and return under obviously full Western backing, Russians kind of assume that he's working with Western intelligence agencies to destabilize Russia. I mean, John Brennan, the Obama's director of the CIA, tweeted out just a few months ago. It's still on Twitter. He's wishing that Joe Biden were president of the United States and Alexei Navalny, the president of Russia, will soon be halfway there. I mean, they're hardly being shy about it. I mean, that's the director of the CIA saying he wants Alexei Navalny to be president of Russia. Navalny does have a history, of course. He was back in the 2000s. He was one of Yale's. He was awarded a World Fellows Fellowship at Yale, kind of a free ride the nail, where they quite specifically they identify what they call rising global leaders and provide individual coaching and training for them to be sent back to their own countries and become leaders, as it were. So there's kind of a long assumption. So his supporters don't care. They're happy to take foreign government help. They are a fringe group, but they are quite dedicated to their opposition to the Russian government, and they would not at all really care that Western governments were helping Navalny to overthrow their government. In fact, they kind of wanted to be so. And it's also quite interesting, and of course, the majority of the Russian people already don't like Navalny, so this will just further reconfirm long-held suspicions and his extremely high negative ratings among the majority of the Russian population. At the same time, it's quite interesting if you look through it. Since this video has been released, Western journalists on Russia are completely flat out ignoring it. They're not talking about it. They're not discussing it. They're not sharing it. They're not denying it. It's kind of a stonewall of silence on the subject. And I would imagine that it will be very sparse, if at all, in print, because that's not the narrative they want to tell about Navalny.
Okay, so like you're saying, Navalny has for a long time been a fringe political figure, but it seems like he's been able to rally somewhat successfully a number of different fringes together in an opposition movement to Putin. Now, admittedly, that is still a small minority. Putin's approval rating still pretty damn high, but he's done what he he could there, I guess. But this clip, I can't imagine that many Russians are comfortable with the idea of foreign and economic interference. It's not that long ago that specifically foreign economic interference destroyed the country in a lot of ways. Gutted a lot of the economic development that was due to take place after the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but how has this clip coming out affected not Navalny's support specifically, but in general, the groups that he's rallied together, even flaggingly? Mark, what's the response been so far from the public?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about his supporters, there hasn't been any response because they don't acknowledge it. In fact, Asherkov himself tweeted out, I am not going to comment on government propaganda. Right. So, he's not going to acknowledge at all that he was in the cafe meeting with this person, much less what they suggested. And it's a little bit early because this was just released in the last 24 hours, really. So there hasn't been a chance for this to hit any type of poll ratings or anything like that. But still, there are hundreds of his supporters outside the courthouse in Moscow today, where his hearing over his violation of his probation for his suspended sentence in the fraud and embezzlement case against the French cosmetics firms Yves Rocher, is being heard today, and evidently the prosecutors are seeking to send him back to jail for violation of his suspended sentence. And there's already, at a word, several hundred have been arrested. So it obviously hasn't affected his core supporters, if they've heard of it whatsoever.
Can you give us a short explanation, just for the people who weren't here last time, of Alexei Navalny? We have about 2 minutes left. Because go ahead, Shane. Oh, I thought Shane said something. I'm sorry.
No, that was Mark. Go for it, Mark.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so Navalny is a political opportunist, and he started out in Russia actually being known as an ultra-nationalist. He's quite infamous for his racist, xenophobic, Islamophobic views. He's very anti-immigrant. He has referred to immigrants from Central Asia and the Caucasus as cockroaches that need to be stomped out, and suggested that he's also a big supporter of so-called gun rights, like in the U.S., and suggested handing out guns to ethnic Russians as a way to solve the immigrant problem. He led some race riots against immigrants in the Moscow suburbs, and headlined an annual Russian ultranationalist march held on Russia's National Day, with imperial Russian flags flying right behind his head, right alongside skinheads and neo-Nazis. He's kind of rebranded himself as a liberal champion and an anti-corruption crusader. At the same time, he's quite specifically in two recent interviews, including just last year in Der Spiegel, reconfirmed that his nationalist political views haven't changed. But he thinks he can appeal both to nationalists and these, fringe pro-Western liberals in Russia, and kind of galvanize them into a force. And that makes him kind of a political opportunist. He's trying to gather together whatever kind of anti-government forces on the far right, liberals, that he can. Obviously with the full backing of the West, and one of the big things, his supporters, whether they're nationalists or liberals, they believe that Russia has a European destiny, and that's assumed kind of a white European destiny, and that shed of all its Asiatic baggage, Russia would be able to, become just a normal country and part of the European Union, as they see it. Navalny is clearly supported by Western media and governments because he's kind of the only real candidate, opposition figure in the Russian political sphere who does have a nominally pro-Western foreign policy ideas, and wanting to geopolitically realign Russia with the West.
So the voice that you guys were listening to is Mark Sloboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at MarkSloboda1. and find him on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. And Mark, again, thank you for coming on. So let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. And we are now joined by two guests, co-hosts of The Gaggle. We got Peter Lavelle, American journalist and host of Crosstalk on RT, and George Samueli, senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute and author. And again, together they are the hosts of Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle, a show airing now on YouTube. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Very good.
Excellent. It's a very cold day in Moscow, but plenty of sunshine. That's just the way I like it.
That is good to hear, and it is that fits the time of the year. Let's get into the Navalny protest. Speaking of Moscow, we were just talking with Mark Sloboda about the clip recently released by RT on Asherkov, an close associate of Navalny's, meeting with an MI6 agent to talk about procuring money for his organization for work. We were just talking about that. You know, let's start on that before we get into the protest more widely. I also want to talk about the documentary that Navalny released a couple of weeks ago, alleging that Putin personally owned a property on the Black Sea. A businessman, Arkady Rodenberg, has since come out and said that that's actually his, that he's the beneficiary of that. But we can come to that. First of all, with this new release, this new clip, what are your guys' thoughts? Peter, let's start with you.
Well, I guess the obvious, I'm not surprised whatsoever. I mean, there's not going to be a lot of people that are going to fund that here in Russia, that is for sure, because you don't see what dividends you get for it. What do you get for investing in that? Okay, so I'm not surprised, and I think most Russians, when they're made aware of it, are not surprised at all that Navalny and his orbit are looking for outside support, because that's where they have the most support, is outside of Russia.
That's a good point, right? So from your standpoint, George, would you go with the same notion that basically the support for all of this, a lot of this, has to do with basically using Navalny as a propaganda asset, as this kind of opposition force? Meaning it's kind of like they say pro-democracy or pro-democratic fascists. Those type of things where we're talking about like Hong Kong or talking about some of the other countries that we're backing. Well, it seems like this is somewhat similar. Just in Russia, the West infuses itself, backs and crafts a narrative around Navalny as an opposition leader. But that's not the image inside the country, or is it?
No, the truth is that the usefulness of Navalny for the West is by staging these protests that are always not sanctioned officially, and that leads to confrontations with the police, as would happen in any country where you go into the middle of the town and hold a protest. You snarl up the traffic. Emergency vehicles are unable to get through, and naturally the police come and break up the protest. And this is what always happens in Russia. And that creates wonderful opportunities for the Western media to show police brutality, violent crackdown on dissent, Putin destroying the democracy movement. And the Western media then duly present this as the appropriate narrative. That's the usefulness of Navalny for the West. And so it's perfectly understandable that Navalny and the people who work for Navalny should seek financial support from the West, because after all, he's doing the West's work for them. So, it's perfectly reasonable for him then to say, yeah, well, we're doing your heavy lifting for you. Can you pay us some money? Now, of course, it's disastrous politically within Russia because for obvious reasons. I mean, if you're being supported by other countries, particularly countries that are adversaries of Russia, that don't have good intentions toward Russia, then obviously that discredits you in the eyes of the Russian people. But it's sufficient. They're not really seeking office. They're not seeking to win elections. That's never been the Navalny organization's objective. They are just seeking to create these confrontations for media consumption.
Well, it's another interesting part about this. And Peter, I want to bring you in on this. The notion
Hang on,
of...
add something to that.
Well, Peter, let me bring you in on this.
It's very important.
The notion of...
It's very important. George talked about unsanctioned protests. Yes, these are unsanctioned. But if Navalny and his people went to the police and said, hey, we'd like to stage a demonstration on this day, where can we do it? The authorities give them options where they can do it, and then the police go and protect them. But as George said, these are unsanctioned, so the police don't know what the aims are, who's going to be there. But in Russia, you can demonstrate. It's perfectly legal. Go to the police, say, this is a number of people who are going to show up. Can you give us assistance? Where's the most appropriate place? But they don't do that.
I think this is also disastrous, just from the standpoint of this being leaked and this being received. Also from the standpoint of the shock capitalism that took place with the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, like, think of Bill Clinton and his actions in the country, this changing the country over from a socialist country into a capitalist country, and all of those people died, tens of thousands. I would imagine that memory hasn't gone anywhere. And if that memory hasn't gone anywhere, it seems like this will be a big, big deal when this hits the papers, or when this is kind of, I guess you could say, digested. Or am I on this? Could you talk about that for the moment? Because is that something that is, I would imagine that's something that is understood in the, let's say, the zeitgeist of the country every bit as much as things that pertain to us in the United States. I would imagine that was a big event. And so this seems like it would take a certain degree of precedence or a certain degree of gravity, considering what took place in the 90s. And Peter, I go with you.
Well, I mean, this is not the first time we've seen this. Remember Pussy Riot? I mean, they were lauded in the West. They even made it into House of Cards, for goodness sake. But it's the same phenomenon. I mean, they're performing, quote unquote, performing because they're just activists. They're performing for Westerners, Western eyes and Western hearts and minds. They had no interest at all in conveying a message to the Russian people about their so-called cause. All they wanted to do was to desecrate places of worship that are are held dear by much of the population, particularly churches that have been rebuilt from the Soviet era, where they were, the biggest cathedral in Moscow right now was turned into a swimming pool. And then in post-Soviet Russia, they rebuilt the mausoleum. So, I mean, again, these are messages that are sent to the West. I mean, are people surprised that Navalny is in the pocket of the West? Of course not. They're not surprised. Most people believe that anyway. I mean, the whole Western narrative on Navalny is just purely bizarre. I mean, most people don't care about him. Number two, they think he's on the take. So, I mean, it's a moot point here.
Okay, so one point of clarification here. Part of the Western narrative on this is that Navalny might not be popular amongst some members of the Russian public, and admittedly they overstate that. But here in the West, we do say that he has managed to rally different parts of Putin's opposition, whether it's communists or nationalists, people across various political fringes. He's managed to pull them together, and you're seeing them come out in these protests. What's your take on that, Peter, from Russia? How accurate is that?
Well, I mean, in 2010, 2011, when there were protests, I went there myself to see for myself. And it's the usual suspects, okay? people that are disgruntled about something, one or another, and it was called the Bolotnaya Square. That's a square in Moscow, and they all congregated there, and it looked like a freak show. It looked like vaudeville. These people all have different grievances. A lot of looky-loos went there, and of course, all Western journalists were there. A lot of television. I mean, it was just theatric. It was just kabuki theater. And I really want to stress, too, a lot of the people that are interested in this, they have no memory of the Soviet Union and have almost none or very little memory of what happened in the 1990s. That's why it is very much a demographic issue here. People do not want to go back to chaos. This is what they fear most. So, again, it's kind of like, if a Russian television station went to Lyndon LaRouche to get what's going on in America, as if Lyndon LaRouche, God bless his soul, he's passed. But why would you go to a fringe person like that to talk about what is representative in American politics? Okay, I mean, even Lyndon LaRouche actually did have a following in the United States. Navalny's following is just people that have some grievances, a lot of young people that want to see, quote unquote, some action. They want to shake things up. Putin is the only president they've ever known, okay? And so he's the power that must be confronted when we all go through our kind of juvenile delinquency of, fighting our parents and fighting the man.
George, we can move on here, but I'm curious. Do you have a take on this one?
No, I think I agree with Peter. The point is that Putin is seen by Russians as somebody who has brought stability to the country and has restored national pride. Those are very, very important qualities for national survival. I mean, you can liken him to General de Gaulle in France. Yep. When he emerged or came to power in the late 1950s, he restored French national pride. I mean, there'd been the humiliation of World War II, there'd been the political chaos during the 1950s, and suddenly this figure appeared. He brought stability because suddenly there were no longer these constant shuffling of politicians. He brought stability and he restored national pride. So when he left in 1969, France was a completely different country. It was just bore no resemblance to the France of the 1950s. And I think the same thing is happening in Russia, that the Russia of today bears no resemblance to the Russia of the 1990s. And for that, the Russian people are very grateful. And that's why they don't want to go back to the 1990s. And they see Navalny, particularly given his sponsorship by the Western powers, that he would just bring chaos and the return of all of the figures from the 1990s, like Bill Browder and all the carpetbaggers who would rush into Moscow to try to scoop up everything. They don't want to return to that. They've had enough of that, and I think that's why ultimately, Navalny just has no base of support there, and that's why whenever any kind of opinion polling is done, his numbers are always below those of the communist leaders, Zyuganov, below Zhirinovsky, all who are of course reviled in the West, but nonetheless they have more standing within the Russian public than does Navalny.
But it would be too cognitively dissonant for the United States to be backing a communist leader, communist opposition leader in Russia. That's a bridge we just can't cross just on the surface of things. Admittedly, if people knew more about Navalny, I don't think they'd like him much in the States either. Guys, we're out of time. Thank you both so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
For those listening, those were the voices of Peter Lavelle, American journalist and host of Crosstalk on RT, and George Samueli, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute and author. Together, they are the hosts of Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle, a show airing now on YouTube. Go check that out. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute with headlines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, so let's get to some headlines in the news. At least 1,990 new coronavirus deaths and 139,293 new cases were reported in the United States on February 1st. Over the past week, there's been an average of 146,409 cases per day, a decrease of 29% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Tuesday morning, more than 26,358,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 443,275 have died from it. It does seem like the number is trending down. Let's hope it does. Cricket Australia said it had, quote, unquote, no choice but to postpone their tour of South Africa in February and March, where the teams were due to play 3 test matches or games in cricket because of the health situation in South Africa, where a contagious variant of the virus has been reported. Minneapolis Public School District staff were expected to return to in-person teaching Monday, but after ruling from Hennepin County, District Court Judge Susan Robner said that the staff and the teachers who had accommodations to work from home or were in the process of applying for them did not have to return with the rest of the staff. The ruling came after the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers and Education Support Professionals accused the school district of denying accommodations for teachers and staff who were either at high risk of contracting COVID-19 or were caring for household members who were at risk for getting the virus. Yeah, right there. That's a big deal. Shane and I have talked about this before, this idea that if your system is going to be somewhat piecemeal, or if you're going to have a situation where you're going to require people to go back to work, there are people who either have family members or who themselves are potentially ill and have a high propensity of death if they catch it. And those people are still caught in this kind of weird quagmire of needing resources by the same token caring or worrying about their safety. And so this is, it's a good ruling in this case, but this is just one. And you have the rest of the country, all 50 states where stuff like this is taking place. So it's good that this is one ruling, but this needs to be done at a little bit more, louder level. In Chicago, roughly 62,000 students and about 10,000 teachers and staff in K-8 were expected to return to in-class learning Monday for the first time since last March. Part of the district's gradual reopening plans, teachers in the nation's third largest school districts voted last month to continue to work remotely, saying the district was insisting teachers return to unsafe buildings. Due to the conflict, Mayor Lori Lightfoot and CEO of Chicago Public Schools said Monday that they had reached an important milestone and that students will continue learning virtually Tuesday and Wednesday as a 48-hour cooling off period. Former President Donald Trump's new political action committee, Save America, brought in $31 million during the final weeks of 2020. The bulk of the money, $30.4 million, was transferred from Trump Make America Great Again committee. That's great. Oregon has become the first state in the United States to criminalize small amounts of street drugs. The law, known as Measure 110, went into effect on Monday. Instead of criminal charge, those found with personal use amounts of heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, LSD, oxycodone, or ecstasy will face a $100 fine. Shane, am I asking for too much to think that that fine perhaps shouldn't exist? Or does that fine have to exist to give a perspective of the government that he doesn't like this behavior? Does it make sense? Like if I tax something, let's say I'm taxing cigarettes, or let's say I'm adding a tax to sugar, and I'm adding that tax because I want to discourage people from basically using the product, even though I don't want to go as far as saying the person can't use the product. Should governments do that? Should they take a purview on those type of items. If there's a drug that kills people, let's say gives people a certain percentage die or get ill later on and whatnot, should the government add in its 2 cents by saying, look, I want to stop people, or at the very least inhibit people from using this particular product or that particular product? Or is this basically stay out and buyer beware?
That's a pretty complicated question. Yeah, a lot of governments assume that responsibility. So sure, technically they're allowed to. We allow them to. And if you're going to do a public health crackdown on something, that's one of the softer and more amenable ways to do so, other than just outright illegalizing it, banning it, and then putting people in jail for using or possessing it, as we of course have done for years. So between the alternatives, I'd take this one. Probably in the long run, different states, as they roll through the legalization process with various drugs, which we can assume to be coming soon, they will experiment with not having any fines, and we'll see what happens then. I mean, for like the most ardent advocates for legalization are often also the most ardent advocates for better treatment pathways, so that if you're a user, if you're somebody who's addicted to one of these drugs, you have access to facilities that will help you go through the rehab process, that will give you clean needles if you're going to use them, et cetera. And of course, there are already, big motions in the process. From the public's perspective, there are a bunch of advocacy groups and policy groups and small communities of people who are working on these things. This has had a massive support depending on where you are in the country. And I know from experience, having lived in Portland, Oregon, a bunch of folks are working on that there too. It's a big issue of concern for them. In my opinion, that's better in the long run. If you make these things legal, if you try to destigmatize them, and if you try to treat it from a medical perspective, hell, here's the thing, man. Portland has its problems with drugs, but if you look at which sections of the country have the most problems with drugs, it's like the Appalachian Mountains and the Rust Belt and a lot of these poorer areas that have had this massive, overly prescribed opioid use, the opioid epidemic, as it's called. And if you're going to have a policy approach to fixing these problems, that should be like the number one center. That should be your number one focus. Of course, the problem with that is if you want to cut off the supply, you have to deal with the pharmaceutical industry. And so in a weird way, you've got to go against the medical industry in order to give people a better medical situation, which is, if you're going to take a serious crack at the problem, you've got to do that. And I think a lot of people are willing to do that. I think if you were to ask the public, should the pharmaceutical industry come under more pressure, come under more legal scrutiny, face more fines, face certain people facing jail time for decisions they made over the opioid epidemic? Yes, a lot of people I think would be 100% on board with that. So in a weird way, I think there's plenty of public support for it. And there, even politically, I think a lot of people have been talking about that. It's just, what actually are you going to do? Are you going to stand up against your benefactors? If you get money from pharmaceutical companies, as a politician, will you be able to stand up against them? I think for some folks, maybe in the long run, but you see where I'm going with that, Jamarl. That's the real issue here.
See, I think the real issue here is poverty, believe it or not. And the reason why I say that is, yes, you can go after drug companies, fair enough, and whatever percentage they're contributing to this. My concern or my fear of that, and this is from personal experience, is that what they do is they tend to put rules in that affect patients more than drug companies. So a person, let's say, need pain meds, and they would be like, there's a stigma on getting pain meds that you need. This person has cancer, this person has neuropathy, this person has something else, and they skimp on the pain meds, acting as if everybody that uses stuff is a narcotics addict. It's nonsense. Now, I get that the place of the drug companies are culpable to some degree. I mean, if you're putting that stuff out in like prodigious amounts, then by, just on average alone, you have a certain number of people who may get addicted as opposed to not. But I think poverty is the issue. I mean, if you're thinking of suicides, if you're thinking of drug abuse, if you're thinking of like self-harm, all of those things seem to come in line with pressure that is exerted on the individual in many of these areas. And I remember one of the recent books, this was a few years ago, where the guy postulated that the issue isn't necessarily drug abuse. The issue is the conditions that those people are in that create the incentive for the abuse in the first place. And if you send a person from jail or you send a person back from rehab, you're basically keeping them in that spot that got them there in the first place. The idea being you have to change their environment if you're going to actually change them. I think I would err on that side more than I think some of the other sides. But like you said, that's a hard one because we don't tend to deal with the poverty stuff. We tend to put that stuff on the individual as opposed to an institution. Like if you went before a judge is not going to look at your life and say, okay, all of these things happen to bring you to, get to this point. She's going to say you're guilty, and she's going to say go to jail or take this fine. And so I do think there's a larger conversation to be had on this notion of consciousness of the public and whether or not how we deal with some of this stuff and whether or not we are undermining ourselves by not dealing with these issues at their roots. So, but yeah, very interesting story, to put it mildly. Several new policies have been announced by Minneapolis and its police department, fueled by the George Floyd death in May, including Minneapolis police officers who would no longer be allowed to deactivate their body cameras in order to hold private conversations during the course of their response to an incident. Police must announce their presence and purpose before entering a no-knock warrant situation, except in certain circumstances like hostage standoffs and banning the use of chokeholds. The city has also revived the policy regarding the review of body camera footage after a critical incident, overhauled its use of force policy, and added an embedded assistant city attorney to advise on police misconduct investigations. Yes, but not enough. And I got to be honest, there was a story that came out yesterday about a 9-year-old that was pepper sprayed. I don't know if you saw this, Shane. The cop, this was in Rochester, I believe. This was in the same area where they were having the protests and they knocked down that old man and put him in the hospital. The guy was asking a question and they knocked the guy down. In this case, the young girl, the cops were called to the home. The kid was acting out. She was 9 years old. And in the video, they're basically threatening this little girl because she doesn't want to get into the car. She doesn't want to go with them. They're trying to separate her from her mom. And the female cop is like, hey, we're going to use pepper spray in your eyeballs if you don't get in the car. She's talking a kid, 9-year-old. They pepper sprayed that child. They pepper sprayed a 9-year-old. At one point, they say, you're acting like a child. She's 9 years old. She says, I am a child. So, that's disturbing, to put it mildly. They put the people on suspended sentence, and her point was, well, we can't fire them because of the union and everything else. Look, these problems with cops go beyond just, there's no-knock warrant and those type of things. Those things, yes, they're big deals. But the problem with cops, I would argue, go into the way that they're taught, the way that they're trained, and the type of people who accrue to that particular position in our society to end up with these bad outcomes. Adding a rule or adding a regulation, I got to be honest, I don't necessarily think it's going to be the end-all, be-all, because those rules and regulations, to some degree, were already there. Oftentimes, you're exploited. What do you think, Shane? Did you hear that story about the 9-year-old being pepper sprayed?
I heard about it. I didn't look too deeply into it.
Yeah, I didn't.
Doesn't sound good, certainly.
No, it's rough to watch. Chicago recorded 51 homicides in January, the highest total the city has recorded in a month in 4 years. Recorded for the month in 4 years. In an Instagram Live last night, a 31-year-old Congressman Ocasio-Cortez blasted Republicans for denying responsibility for the Capitol siege and being told to move on from the riots. She revealed that she was a survivor of sexual assault. That was a really interesting clip, and it was disturbing, if I'm being honest, in the way people regarded that. She basically disclosed that she was part of a sexual assault, that somebody assaulted her. And she was arguing that, basically explaining her situation during the attack on the Capitol. And she was saying how she was hiding behind the door, how somebody basically came into her office, they were banging on the door, came into the office, she's hiding, and she's thinking to herself, oh my God, this is it. Like, they're coming to get me in this kind of way. And she even talks about how she was rushing to get to the other person's office in order to kind of cower while all of this stuff takes place. Her point is basically, I've endured, I've had an assault. And this brings back very bad memories. not to mention this kind of fear that was involved in them not necessarily entirely understanding what was happening and realizing that people had been sending death threats and all of a sudden raiding the Capitol. So the response to people on her saying that was very, very strange, very, very bizarre, and a little empathy goes a long way. Let's do this. Let's take a break. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. So we are in an open segment. Let's do this. I want to have a conversation about what took place in regards to the last segment for talking about AOC. And that topic has more to... So let's do this. Let's talk about Cuomo. We can do that. Now, we were mentioning Cuomo. This was the thing I did my monologue on. And in discussing Cuomo and discussing what took place in New York, there's this weird phenomena where these guys are getting credit for stuff that they didn't necessarily do. So this article came out, let's see, this was yesterday, I believe. 9 top New York health officials have quit as Cuomo scorns expertise. Now, we spoke about this early on, but what this basically boils down to is that Cuomo is blaming the various members of the department for, let's say, some of the negative rollouts or for the vaccine, or for that matter, even some of the policy. So right here, this is New York Times. The Deputy Commissioner for Health and Public Health in New York State Health Department resigned last summer, soon after the director of its Bureau of Communicable Diseases of Control also stepped down. So did the medical director for epidemiology. Last month, the state epidemiologist said she too would be leaving. She's sick, or they're sick, of Cuomo basically offshoring blame to them. And yeah, Cuomo is getting a lot of credit that Cuomo in no way should get. Especially that quote saying that he lays on his pillow, goes to bed night very, very well and all this other stuff. So Shane, from your standpoint, and from, how do you see this? Like, how do you view basically this offshoring of blame, this shaping the image around themselves as if they've done exceptional work when they've been responsible for twice as many deaths from nursing homes as was actually reported? How do you view this? We spoke about this a little bit earlier, but what's your thoughts?
Okay. So for one thing, it's ridiculous, and for another, it's pretty predictable. He is a bog standard politician in that respect. He's worse in a lot of ways, though, because he has trumpeted and written books about his leadership and been the recipient of adulatory commentary for months now by the Democratic and media establishments. And that's changing pretty quickly after this last week's revelations. But it's worth pointing out, this is how they treat you. This is the kind of coverage they'll give you. As far as I'm concerned, I think Trump was terrible on COVID. I think Cuomo, if anything, was at least as bad, if not worse.
I think so.
But I think they are on effectively the same moral standing when it comes to how they've treated this stuff. Now, the difference is Trump is now out of office.
Right.
Cuomo is still in office. And for months there, during the summer last year, Cuomo was getting the soft treatment by the vast majority of people who chose to cover what he was doing and his response. Now, part of this was, he was doing those regular briefings. This is, of course, what he actually received the Emmy for, is he was doing, just to point out, he received an Emmy.
Right.
He was doing regular briefings letting people know what was going on in the state. In the process, though, he made himself a public figure in a clear political bid for more public support, and then it completely backfired when he effectively refused to take any responsibility for the crisis of basically unprecedented and unparalleled proportions in his state, where New York was for a long time the epicenter of COVID and is the state that was hit hardest by COVID in terms of its total impact. We've talked with people. Go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, just to nail it down. I mean, the majority, it's like 42% of the deaths take place in 0.6% of the locations. In this case, we're talking about nursing homes. He shoved people into nursing homes, preventing testing for people to determine whether or not those people were stable before going into the nursing homes, or that they had COVID, disallowed testing while they were in the nursing homes, and even, went further into protecting those facilities from litigation. Like, this was one error, not to mention closing early. There's an article out, The Tale of Two Cities, that talks about San Francisco and New York City and how Cuomo took like a week later to close. But within the context of that week, because COVID expands exponentially, well, you end up with a situation that dramatically outstripes some of the other states. So, yeah, Shane, I mean, this was a failure on like a Herculean proportions. And to come back later and for him to you find out that the deaths were double from the nursing home standpoint. Oh, that looks even worse. And he wrote the book. He wrote the book on American Crisis, talking about the COVID situation. That's mind-blowing.
Well, on Friday, he was responding to this report that was released last Thursday by New York's Attorney General, showing that his administration had discounted deaths, had undercounted deaths, and that if you counted up the actual number of people, the number of nursing home deaths is 50% higher than originally thought. That's approximately 4,000 extra people who died who weren't initially released. So that's a lie. He didn't, and then that came out Thursday. On Friday, he responded in the same press briefing that he refused to take any responsibility for that, instead blaming the previous administration, blaming the HHS, Health and Human Services. Instead of taking any responsibility for it, he talked about how he didn't trust experts, and he effectively pushed away his own medical bureaucracy. Now, I've got my problems with medical bureaucracies. I think in a lot of ways, different medical bureaucracies have bungled COVID response, but they did better than Cuomo. That's for sure. Andrew does not look too good when it compares to when he is compared to his staff. And for him to do that, again, this is another way in which I would say it puts him on the standing of Donald Trump in a weird way. They both rejected the medical establishment's advice, especially when the medical establishment's advice was better than their own, when it would have been more useful for dealing with the crisis. So, I mean, you open this segment talking about this article, talking about how these 9 leading officials have decided to step away. Cuomo pushed them away. I don't know how else to say it. And he's not that much better than a bunch of folks in this country and around the world who completely reject even the idea that we have a serious virus that is killing people, which I don't know how many of the people in the audience have had to deal with this personally, but I've seen them and I've had conversations with them. There are certain folks out there who literally think this is a flu like any other, that its presence is being completely overstated, that it's all an illusion effectively, that we're all being lied to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is he that much better than them? Or is he worse because he absolutely mishandled this, all the while rejecting the opinions of people who could have corrected his worst tendencies and then refusing to take any responsibility for it? What's going to be the reckoning, Jamarl?
That's the interesting part. I don't think there is going to be. Now, the reason I say that is because he is cloaking himself in this, image of mastery of things, right? And you got like 40,000 deaths in your state. Many of the other Democrats and liberals have also basically pretended that this image was correct. That, because to be fair to Cuomo, and I'll give him this, at some point, he started to have these lectures, and I think people were comparing his lectures to Trump. And they would look at one and say one sounds clownish and the other one sounds competent. The problem is Cuomo has 40,000 deaths on his back. So the idea that one sounds, clever. Okay, he sounds clever, but the decisions that he was making, let's be honest, were a certain degree of incompetence. And here's another one. The trouble rollout. This is talking about the rollout of the vaccination program. This is something else that Cuomo screwed up. The trouble rollout came after Mr. Cuomo declined to use the long-standing vaccination plans that the State Department of Health had developed in recent years in coordination with local health departments. Mr. Cuomo, instead, adopted an approach that relied on large hospital systems coordinate vaccinations, not only of their own staffs, but also of the population. In recent weeks, the governor has repeatedly made it clear that he believes he has no choice but to seize more control over pandemic policy in state and local health. Health officials, who he said had no understanding of how to conduct a real-world, large-scale operation like vaccinations. Now, understand what we're saying here. This idea of the vaccination rollout and everything else, like Shane said, he's going after his experts as being the problem with the rollout. Problem was it's not the experts. It's not the experts. Let's place that squarely where that blame is earned. And that blame is earned directly with Cuomo, whether you want to talk about the vaccine rollout or whether you want to talk about the number of cases that New York has had to deal with. They've had more deaths than some nations, to put it in perspective. And, like we said, the number of deaths at the nursing homes might double the number of people that died in 9/11. So, yeah, this is, Cuomo is going to get all sorts of credit for it. Cuomo is going to have Democrats that act like he was some kind of liberal savior in comparison to Trump. And in no way are they going to be straightforward in showing how, despite him being able to talk competently, the choices that he made were pretty bad in the beginning and with the rollout. So that's the way I see Cuomo. And like I said, I've done stories on Cuomo going back several months. Even when this first story came out about the whole the number of deaths and everything else. Because my thought was, how do you have this many deaths on your conscience and they give you, like you said, an Emmy? Or you write the book talking about how competent you were in ensuring this many deaths. It's very bizarre. Very, very bizarre, Shane.
Well, it's because he's an actor. The reason he got the Emmy is because he was good at acting. It's not because the things he was saying were actually helpful. And he's an author, I guess a fiction author, not a nonfiction one, because he's writing a book on leadership and he's failed this catastrophically. Another side of this, if you look at New York, we've talked before about how you can have the worst of both worlds. Last year, there was this big debate about whether we should prioritize the lives of individuals or whether we should be focusing on the economy. Now, in my opinion, that's a false dichotomy. And I think you can see that very clearly with what happened with New York, where you had over 40,000 deaths. You had tens and tens and tens of thousands of people who died from COVID. And you had economic catastrophe, the likes of which New York hasn't seen in many decades, if not centuries, if ever, as far as I can tell. We've had conversations with guests who live in New York, who live in Manhattan, who live in the area, who've said, it's like nothing I've ever seen before, like nothing I've heard about, where like half of all storefronts, at least a third, but up to half and over half in many cases of all storefronts are boarded up. Here's a specific example of something that I'm just going to throw this in that makes absolutely no sense to me. This is from conversations we've had with guests before too. And of course, widely known, if you look into it, many New York restaurants, you can't do indoor eating. So they've set up these outdoor booths, which are pretty much entirely closed in. Like you have plastic screening and wood planks set up, and it's admittedly a bit colder, but I'm sure they're keeping it warm. But the point is, you have recreated an indoors outside. Now, it's New York, it's winter, it's cold. I get it. You want to be, protected from the elements, but it just seems to me like the example of something that pretends to solve the problem when, if anything, it just extends it. Am I making any sense here, Jamarl?
No,
it seems ridiculous to me.
It's like they want their donuts, but they don't want the sugar from the donuts. I want my coffee, but I don't want the caffeine. You know what I mean? It's like I want to be able to eat bonbons and have a six-pack, like, I don't know, dude from 300. Yeah, there's some things that run in tandem with one another that are inextricably linked in the way that they're connected. It's not a bug, it's a feature. It's kind of, the way it is. I think my biggest issue, to summarize before we close out, has to do with this notion of Cuomo acting as if he's the leader of all this stuff. By the same token, not wanting to accept the responsibility of making the decisions. You can't have it both ways. Those are your headlines. Well, we already did the headlines. This is the next thing. We'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're coming back with Lee Stranahan. That should be an interesting conversation, to put it mildly. Back in a moment.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined now by Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Lee, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Doing well. Thanks very much for having me. See, it's a little early. I'll say that. That's one thing.
It is. No, this used to be a regular for you, but I'm sure you've shifted. Your show's quite a bit later on.
Yes.
And again, folks can check that out, The Backstory, 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern, Radio Sputnik, or 3 to 5 p.m. our time, as we are currently residing.
I should just mention with my new co-host, the great John Kiriakou. So that is a new thing that we've done over at The Backstory, which is it's now John and I co-hosting, and it's been great.
That's good. Yeah. And we've had John on a couple of times since he came back on the network. I think twice in just the last week. Glad to hear he's doing well. And you said the show's going well so far?
Yeah, it's going very well. People seem to like it quite a bit. And John and I like it quite a bit. So there we go.
That certainly helps.
That's everybody.
That's definitely a good thing. Exactly. All right. Let's talk about this documentary. So we're talking about a documentary called The Reunited States that has been debuting in various forms for the last week. It'll be coming to Amazon and a couple others on February 9th. The main thing here is who's behind it, where you have, again, the title of the documentary, The Reunited States. So you'd think this is something about trying to bring the country together. It's a documentary. It's going to be nonfiction. Who is it trying to represent? What voices is it trying to bring out? And the executive producers, just to give the punchline to the joke away, are Meghan McCain and CNN's Van Jones. So the daughter of John McCain, and Van Jones, the man who I'll just note has repeatedly cried over various events over the past couple of months. It's been a little bit embarrassing to watch, but that's from a distance, admittedly. Anyway, if this is what the United States, we haven't gotten into it. We'll get into the documentary itself and some more of the details here. But if this is how the United States is going to be reunited, I frankly do not want to live in those states. Lee, I know you have some thoughts on this. What's your take?
Well, so I have some history with Van Jones and with Meghan McCain, but more with Van Jones, actually. My big problem with Van Jones isn't so much his ideology. It's his inauthenticity. That's really my main issue with Van Jones. So I go back with Van to a feud that he got into with Andrew Breitbart back when I was writing at the Huffington Post, and I'd started to work with Andrew Breitbart. This would have been, a decade ago, something like that, 10 years ago. And again, I was writing at the Huff Post, and I'd met Andrew, and I liked him. And Andrew founded the Huffington Post. It was his idea, basically. He was one of the instrumental people in the history of the Huffington Post because he used to work for Arianna Huffington. And it was his idea. He said, Arianna, you need to take your golden Rolodex and you need to start a blog for your celebrity friends. And she did, and he was literally instrumental in the founding of the HuffPost. And so a lot of people don't know that, and I didn't know it. And then I met Andrew, and I found it in the course of my research. And Ariana and Roy, who was the editor at the time, always spoke very highly of Andrew, even when people on the pages were slamming him, which they would do frequently. And so I had suggested to Andrew, hey, and this actually goes more along with the theme of what Meghan McCain and Van Jones are talking about and like I say, it's one of the reasons I have a problem with the dude. So I had the idea. I said, Andrew, I think it'd be good if you still wrote at the HuffPost sometimes and give a little bit of a different perspective. And just to prove how much they love free speech, as soon as Andrew wrote one column, a number of editors threatened to quit over at HuffPost. They said, we don't want to have a different voice here. And so they threatened to quit. And Van, who had some romantic involvement with Ariana, apparently, was one of the people who was upset about it. And Andrew referred to Van as a commie, because he is. Right, and that's why I say inauthenticity. Van Jones was part of a radical group in San Francisco called STORM, and I forget what the full acronym stands for, but it was a radical socialist. By their own definition, group, and he insulted Van Jones, and then they kicked Andrew off of the Huffington Post. They said, "Okay, bye. You can't be mean to Van Jones because that'll make Ariana upset." And so he was thrown off. Now I thought, and I quit the HuffPost over that because I'm in favor of free speech, and I thought it was a weird thing to do. But the thing I don't like about Van is that if that's who you are, if you're a radical socialist, then be that. Just be who you are. This is a guy who came up. One of his mentors was Eric Mann. Eric Mann's the Weather Underground. He was with the Weather Underground. He was arrested, spent time in prison. Eric Mann was one of Van Jones' mentors. Eric Mann is also the mentor of Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. Okay, that's fine. If you don't like that ideology, then you won't like it. If you like that ideology, then cool. And but Van never he wants to be liked more, in my opinion. And Meghan McCain is somebody who I literally, when we talk about people on the right, I don't know a single person. I really mean it. I'm going to think for a second. Nope, don't know anybody. I don't know a single solitary person who likes Meghan McCain. Not one. Not one. So, not on the right. So if you're going to have two people do a project like this, which I'm actually in favor of. I'm actually in favor of, bringing people together and disparate voices and all that stuff. This is not who I would be having doing it. That's all I'm saying.
And just to be fair, though, but you don't know Van Jones. Like, you don't know him directly. You just know of him.
I've talked to him a few times. He blocked me. And then I actually spoke to him at CPAC a couple of years ago. And so that's my knowledge.
I guess what I'm getting at is just because he was part of an organization doesn't necessarily mean he's trying to overthrow America. Like, the idea that you're calling a guy a communist, just seems outlandish to me. Let me ask you this. Has he said anything? Like, is there a quote that you can give to him, or is it just his previous organizations that he was a part of?
Well, like you say, he used to do a podcast, and he had Eric Mann as a guest. And in my research on Black Lives Matter, I found those broadcasts. Van Jones was, period. He came up as a radical community organizer, so I forget I could find it in a second, but STORM was 100% a radical socialist group. There's not a question about it.
No, it's not that's not really what I'm questioning. I'm questioning whether or not he's a communist now. Like, even if, let's say for the moment, let's postulate that he was. Give benefit of the doubt. I don't know if that's true. Benefit of the doubt. The storm thing, yes. Just because he was something, people grow. Like, I can go over thoughts and ideologies that I had when I was younger that are far different than what I have now. I guess my issue with this is, how do you know he's a phony? It's very possible that what he's telling you is just what he's telling you. That's who he is. You're taking it as a phony because you call him a communist.
And by the way, STORM stands for Standing Together to Organize a Revolutionary Movement. That's what STORM stands for.
No, Lee, I get that. I'm making a point about now. I'm saying, why do you think he's a communist now? You called him a phony. You said he wanted to be like.
I didn't say he's a communist now.
No, that's not what he said. He said that Andrew Breitbart called him a communist years ago, and then got kicked off of Huffington Post because of that. But basically, apparently, because Van Jones and Arianna Huffington had some kind of history that might fit into it somehow. Is that right, Lee?
Yeah, and by the way, Van had been a self-described communist. There's not any question about that. And my point wasn't even that, and I don't think I would have called him that, but it wasn't inaccurate. However, the thing that bothers me about it is, if that was your ideology, and again, I can speak to this with some experience. I used to write for Huffington Post. I used to be a libertarian, like a pretty hardcore libertarian when I was a teenager. I've been through political changes. And so Van Jones to me would be a lot more interesting if he would say, this is, because I think I know what happened to Van, by the way. I think he went Alinsky. I think looking at his career trajectory, I think I know what happened, which is I think he decided he wanted to eat better and feed his family, and found a good way to do that. But I wish he would talk more about it. I wish he would say, so I was a black nationalist communist when I was growing up, or when I was younger, or when I got my start in politics, or I stopped being that 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or I've never stopped being it, or whatever. I never hear Van Jones talk about he's got movement knowledge. The guy knows his stuff. This Storm Manifesto, it was a serious piece. I never hear him talk about it. He's a communist black nationalist at some point. Never hear him talk about it. And that bothers me. Just if that's what you were, say that's what you were. And so it makes Van to me less interesting. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, I hear you on that one. You know what? Let's go into a slightly early break. We're joined by Lee Stranahan. He is a longtime journalist and the host of The Backstory, airing right here on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday. You can follow Lee on Twitter at Stranahan and check him out on YouTube at populist.tv. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan, and we will be back on the other side of this break in just a moment.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Lee Stranahan. He's my dad, also Sputnik News analyst, and the host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Lee, last time we had you on was January 4th. almost a month ago, and just a couple of days before what happened on Capitol Hill, before as the House of Representatives was counting the ballots and debating over the results of the Electoral College, a bunch of Trump supporters stormed the Capitol. This event has been portrayed in a couple of different ways, but for the most part, I think accurately, which is a pro-Trump mob decided to break into the Capitol building at Trump's behest. Not necessarily, I wouldn't not say that he was calling for violence, but he was definitely trying to get them up there. I kind of want to work our way up from there and quickly get into where you think Trump is going, where you think the Republican Party is going. Does Trump as a political figure have longevity? But first, let's start with the events of the day. What do you think about happened back on January 6th?
Well, obviously it was bad. I don't know how else to put it. It was exactly what I had been warning about, but worse. It was worse than I think anybody anticipated happening. I would never, I've always hated QAnon, for instance. Let's just start there. And I saw it a few years ago as an obvious play to make Trump supporters, A, look bad, and B, actually be bad. It made people stupider. And that was my objection to it going back, years. And so as I saw it rolling up, and as I saw people who I had known, like Ali Alexander, start to get nuttier, and as I saw the Sidney Powell, Lynn Wood thing starting to spiral out of control, basically, I could see what was happening. And when I saw this event, and I saw the way Ali was talking on Twitter, for instance, and saying things like, I'm willing to die for this movement. Like, that's a quote. I'm like, yeah, that's not good. It was becoming very cult-like. And he was obvious.
Let's just pause on that. Ali was one of the main leaders of the movement.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And I got to the point in the run-up to that where I was just openly attacking him on Twitter and saying, what are you doing? You need to get professional help because you're having some sort of breakdown. Of course, when it went down, he was not one of the people in the building that didn't surprise me either. But I could see this whole thing building up over the past few years. What I didn't think is it would get to the point of them actually getting into the Capitol. I mean, no one saw that part coming. That was unprecedented. And so to me, it was not the thing. I guess here's the other part that was really disturbing to me, but it's not surprising to me. I wish it were more surprising. Is the complete lack of personal responsibility or movement responsibility that anybody was taking afterwards. I saw the same stupid stuff I see, which is, you'll still see it. There are Trump supporters who still don't believe that was Trump supporters. They believe it was agent provocateurs. They believe it was, a false flag. And it's literally stupid. And again, this sort of goes back to what I was saying in the first segment. Just own it. If this was obviously a Trump-inspired group of people, there may have been a couple people who weren't Trump-inspired in it, and the number of them and their role is minor. So I go, okay, well, I'm really going to ignore that, basically, in the same way that if there were on the left, when I see a Black Lives Matter Antifa riot, let's say, I just call it for what it is. I say, well, that's what it is. And that doesn't mean that every single person there was, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, in any large group activity, you might get a small number of stragglers or people who are in there just to create trouble or whatever from the other side. Yes, that may happen. And I'll call that out. But this is obviously a Trump-inspired thing. Now, it had the effect. All of that being said, and this is not to justify anything, but we had this discussion on my show yesterday with Michelle Witte from Political Misfits here on Sputnik. And she agreed, and so did my co-host, John Kiriakou. The response in the Capitol to what happened right now, tens of thousands of National Guard troops, is insane. It makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, that response after, and again, this is not to downplay what happened. It was unprecedented. And by the way, it's a bigger deal in my mind than, let's say, one of the Black Lives Matter rallies when they went towards the White House. That was different. And the reason it was different is Congress was literally in session doing, voting on the electors. And so that takes it to a whole nother level. That being said, the reaction that we currently have in DC over it, and again, I'm in South Dakota, so I'm only going by reports, but there's still tens of thousands of National Guard troops there. That is crazy to me. So, and I also think the Democrats are overplaying. This was never going to be an effective coup, period. This is never going to work. 5 people died, so it is serious. And by the way, I'm also one of those people who has no particular sympathy for Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was killed by the police there. I've looked at the video. I understand why she got shot. And so I'm not one of those people who, you see a lot of people on the right. It's very interesting. As soon as this happened, they suddenly became big critics of police shooting unarmed people. And I have the same principles. I don't really care what your ideology is. If you're trying to get through a barricaded door and there's somebody with a gun on the other side, and you're part of a mob trying to get through a barricaded door in Congress, play stupid games and win stupid prizes. That's,
Yeah. No, I feel you. I don't know if I could disagree with you on the presence of the military afterwards. Now, let me explain what I mean. I agree with you that the censorship that's going to come as a result is going to be horrendous. I agree with you that there's going to be pressure on the various tech companies. So that's fair. And I would even go so far as to say this notion of these guys passing laws for like domestic terrorism might, even goes too far on many respects for something that took place this one time. And I fear that they will be used for other things, for other protests that may take place where those laws come into force in a way that the people who are pushing them aren't necessarily paying attention to right now. But that said, a show of force, I don't think it's insane to have a show of force. Meaning, if you have a Capitol, a putsch attempt, regardless of how ridiculous it seemed from the standpoint of the mob going to the Capitol, well, that's, if you have that taking place with a president who's also basically, trying to get the various members to overturn the election results or get rid of the Georgia or find votes and all this other stuff. If that's the reality that you have, and you have all of these people raid the Capitol, I don't think it's insane that a sovereign power will respond in a way that tries to get across that it is indeed a sovereign power. I mean, at the end of the day, do you see this and the hit on the Capitol and think of the people who are in it, meaning the people who had the responsibility of defending that particular place? That, to them, is an undermining of sovereignty to have somebody basically raid the Capitol. So do you think that's where that's coming from? And do you still think that's overkill in regards to the people and the guards that they had in the Capitol immediately after the putsch attempt? Especially, by the way, since there were other calls for more protests, meaning that was looked at as being successful. And as such, they were trying to have more of those. So do you still think it's out of the realm of necessity to have that many people come the very next day or something to that effect to bring down hysteria?
Yeah, it's not the next day. It's not even the next day. There are tens of thousands of troops in D.C. still. But that's my understanding. I asked Michelle's there and John's there. It's thousands. I mean, there's thousands, 7,000 troops. That's completely overkill. 500 troops would be a lot of troops. That'd be a lot of people. That'd be a big presence. 1,000 would be that. 10 times that, 20 times that is crazy. There's no additional, especially when all you'd have to do, even if they did stuff like they had some sort of checkpoints, it wasn't like people snuck into DC. But what they're doing, just there's no proportionality at all.
Symbolically, it's bad. I mean, just in terms of the reality, it's crazy. But in terms of symbolically, what it means for America and the precedent that it's setting. I mean, if you look at what happened on Inauguration Day, I'll bring this number back up. There were 25,000 National Guard troops there and about 1,000 attendees for Joe Biden's inauguration. That is a ratio of 25 to 1 security personnel to attendees of the event itself. You might reverse it, and that would seem a lot more normal. If there were 25,000 attendees and 1,000 guards, that's like a normal day. You reverse that, and it's crazy how disproportionate it was. Now, admittedly, we didn't see anything happen, so maybe that prevented it. You know, you didn't see another attempted breach, some kind of riot showing up. You didn't see something, but we didn't see it. So it ended up being, as far as we can tell, unnecessary. And regardless, the fact that it's still ongoing, like you're saying, is ridiculous. And I'm worried they're talking about making the barbed wire and the barricades that they have set up. They're talking now about making those permanent. So for Congress to effectively be permanently set apart from the American public, no longer something that you can easily get into and visit. I mean, if you think, we've lived in DC, obviously. You'd have school buses of kids that would come in and hang out around the city and check out the different monuments and the different national sites. It is symbolically creating a permanent barrier between the American public and the organs of government. And I'm worried about that, what that means on that deeper level. Lee, we've only got a couple of minutes here. Where do you think Trump is going as a political figure in 2022 with his family running, in 2024? Where do you think Trump is going as a political figure? And where do you think the Republican Party is going on this side of what Trump did? Lee?
Well, you know, the problem is Trump is ostensibly the leader of the Republican Party. I don't think the impeachment's going anywhere just based on the numbers. It's obvious. The impeachment is going to fail in the Senate. And that's purely show. I don't think Trump has much of a credible political future, which I think was part of the whole idea of the exercise. My opinion is that the QAnon movement was a way to demolish Trump. It was a way to promote people like Mike Pompeo, which it did extensively, who never had the country's interest, but even Trump's interest at heart. And so, I see that the Republican Party is right now in pretty much complete disarray because the other side of it, people like Meghan McCain or people like Mitch McConnell, they're not better in any way. Ideologically, they're definitely not better. And so, the Republican Party, and no one's emerging, I don't think either, as a clear alternative to anybody right now. There's nobody, even a guy like Rand Paul, who I think does a lot of good stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I think you might have overheard Andre. We're about out of time. Lee, what you were saying there makes complete sense. We got to have you back on to talk about this more sometime. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Have a good morning.
Hey, you too. For those listening, that was Lee Stranahan, Sputnik news analyst and host of The Backstory, a show airing Monday through Friday here on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. You can check Lee's work out on his Twitter at Stranahan. Also follow him and The Backstory on YouTube at populist.tv. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we'll be back in just a minute with headlines. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more across this country, as well as across the fragmented surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, getting back into the headlines this morning. First up, in COVID news, at least 1,990 new coronavirus deaths and 139,293 new cases were reported in the U.S. yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 146,000 cases per day. That's a decrease of 29% from the average 2 weeks earlier. I'm going to point this out. Yesterday, the decrease was 32%. Today is 29%. You want a higher number there, obviously. You want it to be going down faster, but it's still going down. We should hope that that trend continues swiftly. If it does, we're going to, if you get a third drop every week, pretty soon you're going to get a much smaller number of cases. Now, that trend won't continue. I'm sure it will level out as we're exiting cold and flu season, ideally sometime soon. But we'll see where that goes. As of Tuesday morning, as of this morning, more than 26,358,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 443,275 have died from it. Cricket Australia said it had no choice but to postpone their tour of South Africa in February and March, where the teams were due to play 3 tests. Those are matches or games in the sport of cricket, because of the health situation in the country. In South Africa, a more contagious variant of the virus has been reported as spreading through community spread, so openly circulating at this point. Back in the States, in Minneapolis, public school district staff were expected to return to in-person teaching Monday, but a ruling from Hennepin County District Court Judge Susan Robiner said that staff and teachers who had accommodations to work from home or were in the process of applying for them did not have to return with the rest of the staff. The ruling came after the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers and Education Support Professionals accused the school district of denying accommodations for teachers and staff who were either at high risk of contracting COVID-19 or were caring for a household member who was at risk of getting the virus. In Chicago, roughly 62,000 students and about 10,000 teachers and staff in K through 8 were expected to return to in-class learning Monday for the first time since last March, part of the district's gradual reopening plans. Teachers in the nation's third largest school district voted late last month to continue to work remotely, saying the district was insisting teachers return to unsafe buildings. Due to conflict, Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the CEO of Chicago Public Schools said Monday that they had reached, quote, an important milestone, end quote, and that students will continue learning virtually Tuesday and Wednesday as a 48-hour cooling off period. In national political news, former President Trump's new political action committee, Save America, brought in about $31 million during the final weeks of 2020. The bulk of that money, $30.4 million, was transferred from the Trump Make America Great Again committee. So that means that they only brought in about $600,000 during the last weeks of 2020. I'm just going to point it out that way. Most of it was transferred from his previous campaign committee. And anyway, I'll be honest, we should come back to this at some point in the future and see how he's doing. Because if you wanted to talk about Trump's political prospects, as many do, part of what you need to do is look at his war chest. From those numbers, it's not looking that great. Put it like that. Oregon has become the first state in the U.S. to decriminalize small amounts of street drugs. The law known as Measure 110 went into effect on Monday. Instead of a criminal charge, those found with personal use amounts of heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, LSD, oxycodone, and ecstasy will face a $100 fine. Several new policies have been announced by Minneapolis and its police department, fueled by the death of George Floyd in May of last year, including Minneapolis police officers who will no longer be allowed to deactivate their body cameras in order to hold private conversations during the course of their response to an incident. Police must announce their presence and purpose before entering a no-knock warrant situation, except in certain circumstances like hostage standoffs, and chokeholds have been banned. The city has also revised the policy regarding the review of body camera footage after a critical incident. They've overhauled its use of force policy, and they've added an embedded assistant city attorney to advise on police misconduct investigations. The city of Chicago has recorded 51 homicides in January. That leaves it the highest total month, the highest total the city has recorded for that month in 4 years. So I'm going to put it like this. Things are still bad. We have, I don't think we've actually on this show, do not believe we have talked about Chicago and the like long-term desperate criminal situation that's there. We've got a guest, Stephen Lenman, who I believe is based in that city. I mean, there's only so much you can say, but it's like referred to as Chirac based on the number of deaths there. And of course, in drawing parallels to war zones in the country of Iraq. It's just a bad situation. That's and of course the home of Rahm Emanuel. So not a good look for him, but not a good look for Chicago either. And it's apparently a pretty bad situation. Just briefly, just because I commented on that. Any thoughts on that, Jamarl?
Yeah, to put it mildly. I mean, the number of deaths that take place in Chicago looks like it would be unacceptable. Now, I find that to be for a lot of things, right? People living on the street or people not being able to eat. Well, I look at this in somewhat similar terms. Yeah, this is a horrendous thing. I mean, the number of deaths in Chicago that has been taking place for God knows how long. And so, yeah, I agree with you, Shane. I mean, this is not a case of success. And if anything, it's almost accepted as just normal, which is even almost more dispiriting, that this gets hit into normality. So, yeah, you're right. I agree.
Yeah, and it is not normal. It's sad that it's become normal for the city. Anyway, let's move on to this one. You wanted to talk about this last hour, so I'm also going to hand this one over to you. In an Instagram Live last night, as 31-year-old Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez blasted Republicans for denying responsibility for the Capitol siege and being told to move on from the riots, she revealed she is a survivor of sexual assault. You had some commentary on this one. Jamarl, what did you think about this?
Yeah, this case, interesting and disturbing on two counts. In one section, you have AOC who basically was telling people that she was she had been sexually assaulted. Now, this came up because she was explaining what was taking place and what was going on in her head during the Capitol riot. And what she basically said was she heard thumps on the door. She's terrified. She's hiding behind the door when the door opens. In her head, somebody is in the room. They're going to catch me. I'm going to get injured. I'm going to get killed. Like, that's not irrational for somebody who gets death threats daily and who, in knowing that she gets death threats daily, knowing that Republicans use her as this kind of whipping post to get their base riled up. Well, in her head, she's thinking, oh my God, they're coming to get me. She says she sees an officer. The guy is angry. He's looking at her. She's terrified. She ends up running, I believe, to Katie Porter's office. And they hide in there, terrified, not knowing what is going to take place, or for that matter, whether they're going to be found. This was being trivialized. Now, the trivialization took place when she mentioned the sexual assault and connecting those two things, showing how this kind of subtle PTSD manifests itself in various situations, especially for a situation like this that was radically out of control and that you had no idea, A, what was taking place in real terms, but also whether or not you were either going to be caught, found, whether that door was going to be open, whether somebody had a weapon. Like, all of these things are unknowns. And because all of those things are unknowns, it makes all the sense in the world that there'll be a certain amount of fear associated with it. And instead of that being accepted, instead of being some level of empathy, it went the other way, with people who were screaming about force the vote, attacking her, or other people who are supposedly on the left, attacking her, as if one issue applies to everything and colors everything. No, you can have two thoughts. A, I disagree with her for not pushing it. B, that's horrendous that she encountered and experienced that. And there should be some level of empathy for some of these, for in this situation. If that was anybody else, they would have been thinking somewhat of the same. And I don't believe for a moment that all of these people that got words at this point would have been these Rambo-esque, chisel jaw people who just stand there unbothered, stoic, as the Capitol gets raided and where you have no idea what's taking place. So, no, this was pretty disastrous as a response. And there were a few people that were making responses attacking her for this. And, one of the points she made was like, look, I didn't bring this up because I didn't want people to disbelieve me. What's more interesting is also Glenn Greenwald, who I typically like. But Glenn Greenwald made a video where he was basically attacking her for showboating and giving her experiences in Congress. Like, I don't know. I just think empathy goes a long way. And especially in a situation where it is easily to foresee how she is perceiving that situation. And for people to basically attack her on that. People, by the way, who want her to pass legislation in their interests. Yeah, that looks bad. It looks really bad. And I got to be honest, whether they had a point on some of the stuff about her imperial policies and stuff like that at times, that's irrelevant to this. That's irrelevant. So, yeah, I just thought it was a bad look with a lot of bad takes on somebody who is a 29-year-old who basically was put in a situation that she considered to be, at that moment, life and death. So that's basically what's been going on.
I hear you on that one. No, and that makes sense. And I would imagine that some people would be attacking her, and I agree. That's not a good move, especially if you're ostensibly on the same side on a lot of issues. This brings to mind a question I'm not actually going to raise now. I'm just going to say it, and then we should come back to it in our conversation with Daniel Lazar in the next segment. But how do we move on from this? It's less than a month since it passed, and so there's still the stuff that needs to be done, still people who need to be charged. But, you do need to move on from it at some point. But what does that process look like, particularly as Democrats do have a big incentive, not trying to single out AOC here at all, but Democrats in general have a big incentive to not want to move on from it, to continue to use it as an example, as an active example of what they fear most about the Republicans. And should we, when should we, all those questions. I want to come back to those, but for now we've got more headlines. In international news, Myanmar's military, also known as the Tatmadaw, declared a one-year state of emergency on Monday in what international observers have termed a military coup. State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi and President Win Myint were among those who were detained during a series of raids that left the chief of the military in power. Now Myanmar's military has issued a notice to airmen suspending all domestic, international, and relief flights until 11:59 p.m. local time on May 31st. Effectively, a 4-month cutoff there for travel. U.S. President Joe Biden has made a statement warning that America could reinstate sanctions on Myanmar in light of the military takeover in the country. Biden's statement yesterday said, quote, the international community should come together in one voice to press the Burmese military to immediately relinquish the power they have seized, release the activists and officials they have detained, lift all telecommunications restrictions, and refrain from violence against civilians, end quote. I'm going to point this out. We have previously imposed individual sanctions on the person who was just yesterday, the night before last our time, put in charge of Myanmar. We've already imposed sanctions through the U.S. Global Magnitsky Act. So what they're talking about here would be national sanctions, as far as I can tell, which, in my opinion, while they might put the pressure on the military that's currently in charge of the country, they also put a lot of pressure on the citizens of that country. And that's not a good thing. We're over-reliant on those tools. But there's also the question, if those are the tools we're going to use, should we be choosing to get involved in this anyway? That's a topic for another time. Sylvestre Ilunga, the Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, resigned on Friday after the parliament's vote of no confidence in his cabinet. Parliament voted last Wednesday to censure Ilunga after President Felix Tshisekedi accused coalition partners loyal to his predecessor of undermining his plans for reforming the Central African nation. Ilunga dismissed this criticism as political maneuvering. In tech news, Chinese phone maker Xiaomi has filed a lawsuit against the U.S. government over Donald Trump's decision to place it on a blacklist, which blocks Americans from investing into the company over its suspected ties to the Chinese military. The former U.S. president, in the final days of his presidency, designated Xiaomi along with at least 8 other Chinese firms as communist Chinese military companies, that's CCMCs, meaning they're believed to have ties to the Chinese military under the National Defense Authorization Act of 1999. Firms designated as CCMCs are banned from receiving stock or securities investments from U.S. citizens or organizations starting March 15th. Xiaomi's Hong Kong-listed stock plunged more than 10% hours after the announcement of its addition to Washington's blacklist. Those were our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan, and we're going into a break. We'll be back on the other side of this break in just a minute with Daniel Lazar.
Fault lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are now joined by our next guest, Daniel Lazar. He's an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He's written a number of books, including From Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. Daniel, thank you for joining us. How are you this morning?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Let's talk about the aftermath of what happened on January 6th, and specifically how we can move on from it. Admittedly, it's less than a month after the events, and people are still processing it. The political system certainly is still responding to it, but I'm worried that we're going to over-respond to it if we can't figure out some way of reconciling ourselves with what happened, charging the people who are responsible, and moving on, because otherwise it's going to become this lingering sense of dread and resentment that, continues to divide Americans against each other and justifies increased encroachments by the national security establishment and by the worst elements of our state. Daniel, I'm throwing a bunch of stuff at you there, but I know you think about these kinds of things, and through this perspective, how do we move on from this? When should we, and what does that process look like? Daniel?
Well, it's moving on is not easy because, first of all, January 6th was a major body blow to American politics. I mean, this is really the worst constitutional rupture since the Civil War. Separation of powers is the nearest Americans have to a national religion. It's something that all Americans believe in. Yet Trump and his followers, by invading Congress, and sending members of Congress running for their lives, literally, just trampled it underfoot. The Confederates didn't even do that in 1861. They really opened up a major chasm in the in U.S. politics. But the problem is they didn't just open up a chasm. What it shows is that the American political structure is really crumbling. The old constitutional safeguards are cracking under the strain. The ancient structure is buckling, and it's no easy task to get it back in working order because the institutions are just so ancient and out of touch with the needs of modern society. So America is in a real pickle. It really has painted itself into a corner in a way that no other society that I'm aware of really has.
Well, I'm curious, when you say America has painted itself into a corner, be specific. Like, where do you place, I don't want to say blame, because blame may be too strong, because I'm pretty sure there's culpability on some level to go around, but where would you place the fault in this? I would imagine you would say it's the Constitution that's driving this level of confusion.
Yes, I would. I absolutely would. The fault, the fault can be spread around. Trump obviously is at fault, but the Democrats are at fault too. Because remember, they spent the previous 4 years trying to drive Trump out of office with the whole phony Russiagate conspiracy theory. And Trump regarded that as a slow motion coup d'etat, and he wasn't far off. because that was clearly the Democratic intention. So the whole system is disintegrating, and both Republicans and Democrats are playing a role.
So,
and Daniel? What do you think? So that sets your perspective on that. Having said that, I don't see a path for impeachment going into the trial next week. What do you think is going to happen in the Senate when they go to vote on this? How do you think that's going to go, Daniel?
Well, I presume that they'll fall short of conviction by a huge number. I mean, only 45 Republicans voted against the idea of an impeachment trial. They saw it as unconstitutional. So, given that 45 and all but 5 Republicans voted against conviction, have already voted against conviction, the idea that 17 Republicans supporting conviction seems to me extremely far-fetched. It's virtually impossible. But one thing I want to know that I'm really curious about is, will Trump testify?
Interesting. Very interesting question. Because if Donald Trump gives his testimony, oh, wow, that's a very interesting question. I never even thought about whether or not Trump would testify on his own behalf. That is interesting. Is it legal? I mean, that seems to be one of the questions that keeps coming up on this whole impeachment after the president has left. If it is indeed to bar the president from coming back, that's the rationale that they're basically giving for it. But is this something that's legal? I mean, I know they want to do it, but...
Well, as far as I'm concerned, impeachment is so open-ended that whatever Congress says is legal in this case is legal. I mean, the Constitution is very vague on this question. So if Congress wants to go ahead and do it, Congress will do it, and it'll be very difficult to say otherwise.
If he chooses to testify, do you think the major news media networks would show his testimony?
How could they not? It'll be electrifying. It'll be amazing.
Well, because they've if you remember, I'll put it like this, just briefly. If you remember what happened on January 6th, a lot of his speeches they didn't show. You'd have a hard time finding. You had to kind of go searching around for it because they chose to show some of it, and then they shut it off at a certain point because they were warning that it was dangerous, as it was soon revealed to be. And then after the fact, it became difficult. Social media networks were cutting it off, and the major news media was cutting it off too. So I don't doubt that they'll show some of it, but do you think there's any possibility they're going to cut some of it out at a certain point? What's your take?
I don't see how they can. I mean, how can they deny the guy a public trial? I mean, are they going to try him in secret? What is this, Moscow, 1937? Are they going to try him in secret with no press there to record what goes on? And are people going to actually try to cover up what Trump has to say? I don't think it's possible. And Trump,
in normal times, I wouldn't think so either. But we are not in normal times, Daniel.
And this is a venue, by the way, tailor-made for Trump. I mean, Trump, for all the bad things you can say about the guy, and believe me, there's a list a mile long. One thing he's very good at is, are these situations in which he speaks extemporaneously and holds his listeners in thrall. He's excellent at that. In fact, he's really one of the best. So this venue, has Trump, has Trump's name all over it. So the Democrats are really like Brer Rabbit. Brer Rabbit's, saying, don't throw me into the briar patch. Well, Trump's supporters are saying, don't throw him into a Senate trial, because that's actually what he really wants, or I suspect it's what he really wants.
I would pay money for that. I would pay money to see Trump testify. to put it mildly. Shane, go for it.
Well, and this is all I was going to say. You were saying he may speak extemporaneously. That's one of his stronger abilities. He may have to, because as we all saw, he lost his legal team over the weekend. His entire legal team fled. Many of them, the reporting at least, is that he had wanted, in his defense, to focus on continued claims of election fraud and specifically voter fraud. So he wanted to focus on that. They weren't having it. That's how it's being reported. Now, Jason Miller who is acting as his de facto press secretary here, has said that that's fake news. He said that those rumors are untrue, but nevertheless, his whole legal team abandoned him. Now, admittedly, he's picked a couple lawyers back up, but this is, again, a week out from the beginning of the trial. My point is, he may have to deliver impromptu remarks because he's not going to have a strong legal defense here. What do you think his defense would be, Daniel?
Well, I think first of all, number one is that with Trump, is that what everyone thinks is a weakness is actually a strength. I mean, the guy is at his best when he's alone. I mean, he constantly fires at all advisors, and assistants. He churns through them. He's there all by himself, and he's kind of liberated when he doesn't have the lawyers to tell him to shut up. So I think what Trump will say is he would pursue the stolen election myth, but he would also stare down the Democratic mob, a bit like Coriolanus, a famous Shakespearean character, and sort of like heap contempt upon the Democrats and accuse them of doing to him what they accuse him of doing to them, turn tables on them by, blaming them for Russiagate and 1,000 other things. And we'll see how the Democrats hold up. But it'll certainly be electrifying if it does come to pass. And conceivably, it could give Trump a new political lease on life.
Daniel, we have about 2 minutes before we go into a break, give or take. I know you push for the changes into the Constitution. I think we've even came across this idea of basically revolution by any other terms. But would you say that, how do you say to people who make the argument that the institutions basically not knuckling under from the standpoint of Donald Trump, meaning the fact that Trump wasn't able to pull out this putsch attempt, that is some degree of an affirmation of the structures of the country, not necessarily an undermining of those structures? How do you confront people that basically make that particular argument about, well, Trump wasn't able to do it because the institution held?
Well, that's a bit like saying I'm so healthy that even though I've got fourth stage cancer, I'm still alive. I mean, the system held together, but the crack up was extraordinary, and it's clear to me it's in deep trouble, and that all the constitutional elements that once helped stabilize the system are now doing the opposite. They're destabilizing the system. They're helping to tear it apart. So, a Trump impeachment trial could be part of that ongoing dissolution if things work out the way I suspect they will. But the system is tearing itself apart. It's falling apart due to sheer old age. It's 233 years old, for Christ's sakes. And it just can't hold together anymore. I mean, no one knows what the Constitution says. No one knows what constitutional even means. And the document is meaningless at this point.
Let's do this. Let's take a break because I want to get into that. I don't think the Constitution is meaningless. So let's get into that particular conversation when we come back. The voice you guys are listening to is Daniel Lazar, an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He's written a number of books, including From Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. We'll be back in a moment. Fault Lines, Thomas and Strenny.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and we are joined by our guest, Daniel Lazar, independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution. Daniel, I'm going to push back here. And we've had this conversation before. I agree, things in America are not going well, but I want a number, man. I hear people talking about the decline and fall of the American empire. I hear people talking about how our demise is imminent. And I admittedly myself complain constantly about our sclerotic institutions, all that stuff. But the things have staying power. Things fall in some cases sooner than you'd expect. And in some cases, it takes a lot longer for that decline to happen than you might anticipate. And nevertheless, I just want to know, when do you actually think, what year do you think we'll see the dissolution of the American state by, in sort of clear terms, Daniel?
That's really unfair. I've got to dodge that question. I mean, timing is
oh, come on.
It could last for years. It could last for weeks. I mean, January 6th. I mean, I was pretty certain that Trump would not go peacefully into that good night, and I thought he would do something. But I was as surprised as anybody by January 6th. And to see a rupture of that magnitude, I mean, really took me aback. So whereas, before the breakdown seemed to be moving slowly, suddenly it accelerated tremendously. So it's just so damn hard to put a finger on these questions. But there's no doubt what the general trend is. I mean, you have a 233-year-old system. I mean, it's falling apart in 1,000 different ways. How much longer can it keep on going in this state? I mean, years, decades, I suppose. But that seems a bit like a long stretch.
I don't know if I have. I guess my thought is revolutions are unpredictable. What Slavoj Zizek? What happens on day 2 of the revolution? I tell my mother to know it. And so, but putting that part to the side for a moment, it would need the belief that there are no recuperative powers into the country. And I do think there are recuperative powers, even if, like you said, they're ossified and frozen to some degree. But I would also make the point that even though our system, for the most part, seems to be fraying, even though it seems to be falling apart, trying to repair that with some kind of constitutional convention or some kind of convention where we're rewriting the Constitution, it doesn't seem to be able to work in a situation of this much chaos. Like, I have to be honest, I shudder to think what would be put in something like a constitutional convention, whereas pretty much everything goes up for grabs, and there's this kind of mad grab to get laws and policy and all of those things changed in the direction or the interests of a group. And there's nothing in me that makes me think that the interest is going to be the poor and the middle class. I think that's my problem with it. Like right now, if we can admit that this country seems to be split, and we can even argue why the country is split. But because the split is there, that it is difficult to kind of mend those sides together to even come to a conversation in regards to what policy do we want to deal with as we go forward. How does that work? Like, do you understand what I'm getting at? Like, I understand that there needs to be a coming together, but how does that coming together happen when, the separation seems to be a feature and not necessarily just a bug?
Well, first of all, you seem to be saying two different things. You're saying on one hand that the country has recuperative powers.
Well, I'm actually,
on the other hand, it doesn't have recuperative powers because there's no way out of the present bind. The current constitutional system is completely and totally played out. There is simply no hope of recuperation under the Constitution of 1787. That is dead as a doornail. It's dying a prolonged death, and the death agony could last months, years, maybe even decades, although I doubt it. But the death agony can only intensify. America does have recuperative powers because the American people, 330 million of them, are like people everywhere. They're resourceful, they're inventive, they're small d democratic, and they want to steer their society in a better direction, just as Americans wanted to do the same in 1787. The question is, how do they do it? What are the institutional mechanisms? And I agree that a constitutional convention of the sort outlined in Article 5 is not up to the task, because Article 5 says whatever the convention comes up with must be approved by 2/3 of each house plus 3/4 of the states, which means that the small states could exercise their unqualified veto power in perpetuity, which is the problem. So what I have in mind is something very different. It's not a constitutional convention. It's called a constituent assembly. It would be based not on Article 5, but on the preamble, which says that we, the people, can do whatever we want collectively to improve our society, up to and including creating new constitutions, and in the process, tossing out old ones. So a constituent assembly would be elected on the basis of one person, one vote, and it would decide according to strict majority rule. So if 51% want to toss out the Second Amendment, out it goes, straight out the window. If they want to modify the First Amendment, modified it is. If the next year, 51% say no, they like the old First Amendment, then the old First Amendment comes back in. And if 51% says, it was a mistake to toss out the right to bear arms, then that right is reinstituted. I don't think that would happen, but it certainly would be possible. But I believe in strict majoritarian democracy. 51% is the sovereign power. They can do whatever they want about anything they want.
I hear you. No, so here's the thing. We've been back and forth on this. We've got our lines pretty well staked out. And, if we had hours to talk in another format particularly, we might be able to make some changes here. But things are pretty much established as they are. I'll be honest, though. That's one solution. There are a lot of solutions. I do believe, I think like both of you, in the recuperative power of people per se, of people generally, who are able to, stand in opposition to things as they are. But with that in mind, I guess I want to come back to this. It sounds like Chicken Little when a lot of folks are talking about the imminent decline and have been, I will say, for decades of the American state, when for better and for worse, the American state facing some serious crises, transfiguring into a different form, admittedly, but it seems to be doing its thing. It seems to be going on for a bit longer. I guess I want to come back down to this because, in other words, if you're proposing that we need a radical solution in order to repair our country on a foundational level, or else it's all going to fall apart. If people have been saying that it's going to fall apart for a long time, I'm less inclined to believe it because it hasn't yet. It's certainly gotten worse in a lot of ways, but it still hasn't fallen. What would we look for? In the long run, we're all dead, to quote Keynes. So in the long run, it is going to fall, but so does everything. That's just the nature of the world. What would we look for? What are you looking for, Daniel? What are the big things?
As the old Monty Python line says, I'm not dead yet. So yeah, the U.S. constitutional system is still on its feet. It's still struggling forward. But over the last half century or last 30 or 40 years, the decay has been amazing, absolutely amazing. I mean, Congress has been in gridlock for a generation. Partisanship partisan hostility is shooting through the roof. We had January 6th, in which a crazed mob, sent Congress running for its life. Now, the system can stagger on in one form or another. Maybe under some kind of strongman rule or I don't know what. But the point is that the longer this goes on, the more unrecognizable it'll become. So it'll become a democracy only in name, but will be increasingly a corrupt oligarchy, in which the poor and the working classes will just take it on the neck.
Well, but you're describing things as they already are, and as they have been for a long time. That's you're speaking in the past tense.
It'll get a lot worse.
It's been getting a lot worse.
Well, it can get. There's still a long ways to go. It can get a whole lot worse more.
That's my point. That's exactly what I'm saying. It could just keep going. And then at some point, there might be some resuscitations of it. But Here's the thing. It could be, you said weeks, you said years. It could be decades. It could be centuries. And my point here is, it doesn't, saying that it's all about to fall apart, or saying that we're on the brink of our destruction, or saying things tantamount to that are meaningless if the brink is 100 years away, as it very well could be.
Well, as I said, someone just said a few minutes ago, revolutions are unpredictable. So, so no one knows why the French Revolution occurred in 1789 as opposed to 1689. It could have very easily have been the latter. Historically, in retrospect, we know why it wasn't, but nonetheless, the offenses were piling up, the regime was running downhill, the average person was being treated more and more outrageously, etc. So finally, in 1789, the revolution broke out, and what's curious is is that a year earlier, the monarchy never seemed stronger or more popular. Yet suddenly in 1789, it just began to collapse in a heap. Now, the American system, we can't predict the future. It can keep running down and down and down for a long time until the whole thing becomes unrecognizable, and the country is more and more a corrupt oligarchical, republic in which the average person doesn't stand a chance. But at some point, things will explode. And the longer the day of reckoning is put off, the greater the explosion. That is one thing that is certain. Change is unavoidable, and the only rule is that the more you try to avoid it, the more radical you'll ensure it will be when it finally arrives.
And unfortunately, I think, like you said, our system doesn't necessarily... Oh, let me say this. I don't think I'm saying two things. I think both things are true. I do think there's an aspect that has a cooperative or a recuperative component to it. Yes, human beings, people, but I have to be honest, even within the context of the system, it seems that stuff, on some level, despite how difficult it may be to change it. Also, I don't necessarily know if it's a good idea to be able to just have a government flipping back and forth. There seems to be a need for some level of stick-to-itiveness, even if it's not a certain ossification in our system. Because I do agree with you on that point. We seem incapable of dealing with just basic things. Like COVID comes up, and we seem incapable of dealing with it. Fires, hurricanes, we seem incapable of dealing with it. And from the standpoint of legislation and law, it seems almost like undetached from the public. So on that front, I do recognize what you're saying. The catch comes, how do you get to that point? We only have about 2 minutes, a minute and a half left. Just from your standpoint, what are you most concerned about outside of, let's say, a collapse per se? But what are you most concerned about as, let's say, the next shoe to potentially drop in all of this?
Well, I'm most concerned about the march to fascism, what we saw on January 6th. I think that's a very real threat. Fascism is a word that's been terribly overused over the years, but I think that that finally it's coming true, and I think that Biden is going to be the flop of the century. I'm absolutely convinced, which opens the door to Trumpism in some form in 2022. And if Trump gets back in power, or if one of his followers do, then checks and balances will be weakened all the more. They'll take their vengeance on a long list of Democratic enemies, and America will take another major step into authoritarianism. It's already halfway there. Now, but I don't know, but once again, timing is really difficult. The future is unpredictable. The chemistry is mysterious. So I can't say when will this occur or how this will occur. And I'm sure at the end I'll be as surprised as everyone else is. But
he's gone.
So the voice that you guys were listening to is Daniel Lazare, independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He's written a number of books, including From Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. You can follow Daniel on Twitter at DHLazare and find his column on weeklyworker.co.uk and Strategic fault-culture.org. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with the wrap.
Fault Lines.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Jamarl, here's the thing. I don't like the sort of vague doomsday arguments, but I also don't like the specific solution. And I like Daniel as a person. I enjoy the conversations, and he's good at arguing for it. And he clearly has knowledge that he likes to bring to the table, and it's good, accurate information about the history of this stuff. But I do not want majoritarian rule. In what decade? Like the 1910s, the 1930s, the 1950s, the 70s, the 90s, whatnot. In what decade do you want most people, the prevailing status quo, to determine the state of society? And if you can extend those arguments to basically any previous decade, I'm pretty sure the future will think the same thing about today. I like democracy on the local scale, and I like limited government. I agree with libertarians on a lot when it comes to that. But majoritarian democracy, as far as I can tell, just sets into place the sediment of the current society. It makes whatever the lowest common denominator opinions are, and often propagandized opinions, the baseline by which everything else is judged. And I'm pretty gosh darn worried that in our more propagandized than ever world, that's going to be the thing. If that were the thing that determined public policy, I probably wouldn't want to live in a country that chose to do things that way. We got calls, 202-521-1320. Any quick thoughts before we go?
Just as a quick thought, I like Daniel too. His solution freaks me out slightly because I don't believe that people often have good intentions. I think oftentimes it's just what they want from the standpoint of some kind of clout or power. And it's one thing if everybody's coming to the process in good faith, everybody's great, it's kumbaya. But I get the strong suspicion that if we're in a situation where the Constitution is basically failing, that this is not a kumbaya moment. This will be a moment of strife. It will be a moment of conflict. And whatever came out of it will probably come out of that specific thing. And so I don't know. It's such an unknown. And look, Daniel, he's right about how our system is ossified. But is this the solution for it? And that's the thing that makes me a little dicey. I do think we need to fundamentally overturn or rework our system. Revolutions are messy. Let's go to callers.
So we've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on, man?
Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. If anybody gonna buy any precious metals, make sure you buy a physical. Like silver, the physical where you put your hand on it. Don't buy the silver stocks, the papers like SLV and stuff. Be careful with the paper. Okay. They have a bill they're trying to pass. Sheila Jackson Lee out of Texas trying to pass a bill, HR 127. It's dealing with the gun license and the Registration Act, which means if you have weapons, you got to register all of them. You got to apply for a license, but before you get the license, you got to go through some hoops. You got to pay for it. You got to get a psychological exam. You have no history of suicidal thoughts, or you can't be drinking like an alcoholic. History of being an alcoholic, or history of being depression. And the age limit goes from 18 to 21, and you got to get it renewed every 3 years and go through training and some other things. I saw somewhere I think it's $800. I think it's for the card or maybe for the training. I was thinking to myself, bunch of people ain't gonna go for that in the United States. They'd be upset. So it's called HR 127 it's out of Houston. Matter of fact, that's the same district I think my Michael E. D. Baker is at. I'm a whistleblower. Mike E. D. Baker, water's contaminated. That's the same district. I wish they can do something about that. Open up a case on my case. Dealing with Mike E. D. Baker, VA hospital. So, yeah. So that's your gun control bill, HR 127. I put a link underneath y'all tweet for today. And also, free Julian signs and drop the charges. # drop the charges and hold the line. That's all I got.
Still pushing on that. I hear you on that one, and you're right for pushing on it. Tarif, thank you for the call. Interesting note right up front about buying precious metals. I'm going to point this out. This has to do with the same folks who are pushing the GameStop stock have shifted over the weekend to silver. And I will note, GameStop's stocks shot down dramatically on Monday when the stock market opened back up. They dropped by like a third on the first day. I need to go and check how they are today because the market's opened up just about 20 minutes ago at this point. So I need to go check that. But they were also pushing for silver. And to your point, you're talking about how people, if they're going to be buying silver, shouldn't be buying paper certificates of ownership of silver. They should be trying to buy the precious metals on that instead. Anyway, Tarif, thank you for the call. You have other callers.
So wait, just to point out,
go next
GameStop currently is at $117. That's after being almost at 400 the other day. Now, also, let's keep in mind.
Yeah, that's crazy down.
Yeah, that's crazy down. And it's not just the hedge funds that were making money off of this. That was losing money. Hedge funds were also making money. The moment that this took place for the GameStop stuff, many of the people who were either hedge funds or people who played the market got involved because they assumed the stock was going to go up for that particular day or so. So some of these places were able to offload millions of dollars worth of like GameStop stock and whatnot in order to make a little bit of make some profit off of it. But yeah, I mentioned before, the fundamentals of the company hadn't necessarily changed, but people have every right to buy whatever stock they particularly want. And in this case, they understood that it was GameStop. They understood that the stock would probably collapse, and the stock did just that. But that's secondary from what these guys did. They were stealing money, for God's sake. The moment that you get a situation where Robinhood or TD Ameritrade with these apps stop letting people buy, but they would let them sell, and you would have larger other people in the market that could buy and sell the stock. It seems like the force or the goal of it was to drive the price down artificially. And so, it's not shocking that this number plummeted, considering the fundamentals haven't changed and considering that these guys were basically doing things in order to get people out of that stock. So, 113. It's a significant fall. Do you want to?
I'll put it like this.
Yeah.
At the end of the day yesterday, GameStop shares had gone down to half of what they had reached on Thursday when they reached their high of about $470 a share. And today, at this point, not too long after the markets opened, they're down to about half of that. They're down to, like you were saying, 120, 117 of about where they were, which is 240, I think, 230, something like that. So it's dropping precipitously. And what this means is a lot of the public paid attention to this issue. What they're going to see happening is they're going to have learned about naked short selling. They're going to have learned about short selling. They're going to have learned that there are crimes being committed by people here, that there's widespread negligence from the SEC. They're not cracking down on this stuff. And they're going to see that continue. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. I don't like the public being disappointed. I'd rather we live in a functional society, but it's better for people to know that a crime is happening than for everybody to just gloss over it. But we got other callers. I think we should go to them. We got Malik calling in from D.C. We're taking calls, by the way, still 202-521-1320. Malik, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey there, fellas. I wanted to agree with what Lee Stranahan was saying earlier. I think what he was saying about Van Jones is mostly true in the sense of he. In the movement, we would probably call Van Jones, we would deliver a political criticism to him and call him an opportunist. I didn't know Van Jones personally, but I did attend organizational meetings in the Bay Area for Angela Davis's organization, Critical Resistance, which is a prison abolition organization. And what Lee was saying is true in the sense of there are folks who came up in the radical leftist movement, who are now, they're very mainstream. They're accepted amongst, liberal, the corporate liberal set. And so I think in many ways AOC is also falls into that category. These are folks who kind of come up in grassroots organizing but have greater aspirations. In political movements, we would probably call these people say that they have middle class aspirations, and often sell out. I would agree with that. I'm far to the left of all those folks, and I don't shy away from that. And I think your father has a good point with that. Is that these folks attempt to try to pretend to be something that they were not in their foundations. I think a lot of these people still believe some of those things, but I think their aspirations outweigh their ideological leanings.
They want to sit on thicker couch cushions. They want to have a more comfortable life. That's part of it. And then for some people, there's also obviously an element of if you go professional, if you put on a suit, people are a bit more likely to listen to you. Now, that's going to change what you're allowed to talk about. That's going to shift your personal Overton window. But I think there's also, like you said, there's opportunism. And I've never met Van Jones and have never spoken with him, et cetera, but I've heard about this over the years. And he does strike me as a figure who's trying to appeal to whatever culture he's trying to be a part of at the time. He's trying to appease his personal masses.
Yeah, I don't know enough about
Mallet.
Oh, go ahead, Shane. I'm sorry. I thought there was a lag. I'm sorry. Finish.
No, go for it. What's your take?
Well, I was just going to say, it's not so much that I took issue with your dad calling him, formerly a communist. I guess I took issue with the phony part because I have no idea whether Jones believes this stuff. And if you look up PolitiFact, where it basically was giving some of the arguments that he made for capitalism and stuff like that, well, I don't know if he's phony or he just changed his point of view. Like you said, the shift of the Overton window. He probably still has these lefty tendencies and everything else, but I think for him, it's the issue of effectiveness and the people who probably he was in the room with. And so, but I guess my point is that's different than him putting on airs or pretending to be something. That's all. That's my only issue with it. Does that make sense? Like,
we should talk with Margaret Kimberly about it at some point. Absolutely. Because I know she has opinions about Van Jones, and I think she'd be able to speak to the storm stuff. We should prep her a little bit, let her know that we're going to talk about it. But I'm curious to hear what she thinks, very genuinely. We got Ben calling in from Ohio. Ben, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, guys. Just a quick note regarding the whole stock thing. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation going around, clearly, to try to scare people off of the stock. But people were going out and buying silver. In actuality, a lot of people were putting their money behind crypto and then buying the dip back. One thing to be mindful of is the volume. Like, not like the actual line, but like the actual volume, or like how many people actually have bought in. If you look at that hasn't really changed much, which means a lot of people have their stocks in and they're actually just like leaving it there. So why would the dip happen? That tends to occur because if you look at like market volatility and stuff like that, a lot of that happens from institutional power, like AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms and whatnot, that have the capacity to make transactions that we can't. And, because once the market's closed, like we can't really do much. Hedge funds and stuff can still trade. Well, if you stop transactions from occurring, the algorithm doesn't know any better. It determines, okay, so for every one sell that occurs, there are 0 buys. So 100% of the time, we're losing something. And that will cause the stock to tank, essentially. Now, on the upswing, it can cause a stock to rise exponentially. But that's really when you look at like these different apps and whatnot, like Robinhood, for example, that has lawsuits and whatnot. You'll notice.
Ben, this is very interesting stuff and stuff that I want to learn more about. Please send us an email, faultlinesradio@gmail.com. We're out of time. You guys, thank you for listening to today's show. We'll be back tomorrow. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you again tomorrow morning.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. Guys, I want to thank all of you for continuing to join us. Interesting show. Lazar, Yeah, very, very interesting show. Between Sloboda, Lazar, and the people that were on. Good guess. We're going to have a conversation. We have to get further into the Cuomo stuff, and we need to get into Myanmar. And Myanmar was the thing that we were trying to find a guest for, and we weren't able to necessarily find a guest for it on short notice. But those are stories that are going to be massive. The protests in Russia, Myanmar, and there's something else. The impeachment. I think the impeachment is going to be big, but I don't think it's going to be huge. It would have to be some lightning rod of interest. Like Daniel made the point of saying, if Trump testifies, that never even occurred to me that Trump would testify. But yeah, that would create a lightning rod, and I think people would draw eyes on that. But our world is interesting world. I'll put it that way. All right, I am going to end this. I'm going to say like, I am going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. I don't know if you're going to see me today. I have a doctor's appointment today and tomorrow. But let's see, a long story short, a little JT's evil. Wait a minute. Is those JT evil look, or is he just squinting? Oh, I'm squinting. I'm sorry. Yeah, a long story. I'm sorry, long story. No, I was squinting. I was trying to, my studio setup has my television and computer like behind, with the camera and everything facing this way. So the big screen and the big monitor that I use to like read documents or going into the script and all that stuff. Well, that stuff is on the monitor. Usually it's not a big deal if I can enlarge the text, but for some of the articles that was playing out, I was looking at an article dealing with a new variation of COVID in the UK, meaning one of the variations that was already in the UK had another variation on top of that variation that made it or lessen the impact of some of the vaccines that were being used, even though they believe the vaccines would continue to work. The worry, of course, has more to do with the idea that, well, what if we get to the point where this thing mutates to a degree where the vaccine becomes ineffective? And if you think about the number of people who were infected with COVID, who, be it in the US, be it the UK, be it India, and you think to yourself, are there going to be groups of those people that can't get rid of the virus, and yet the immune system can't get rid of, and yet the immune system can't win? Meaning the virus can't kill them and the immune system can't win. And it creates a petri dish for that thing to grow, proliferate, and to become something different. My point is, part of the problem with not being able to flatten the hospital numbers, not being able to keep the people who are infected with it down, is the potential for mutation and the probability of that potential going up, but more the number of people who are infected with the virus and the longer duration that this virus basically hangs around, especially with so many people being infected. So I was reading the article. I was trying to add it into headlines, but it was too late to add it into headlines. It just came out like an hour ago. All right, I'm going to end this. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe, and I will see you guys in a few. Thanks all.